Hello, everybody, and welcome to Goodman Games Cyclops. Brought to you by our Cyclops is the best sword and sorcery stories of the 20th century. And with me, Howard Andrew Jones, are a slew of really awesome panelists. Let's start with Brian Murphy, who's next on the screen beside me. Tell us about yourself, Brian.
Hey, Howard. Well, thanks for having me on. I'm pleased to be part of such an awesome panel. Brian Murphy. I suppose I should introduce myself. The author of Flame and Crimson, A History of Sword and Sorcery. You can pick it up at your local bookstore. That'll be my one obligatory plug. But I've been, a fan of sword and sorcery going back to the early 80s. You can read all about my first encounter with Robert E. Howard in the pages of Savage Sword of Conan magazine, comic book, back in the early 80s. Became a love affair with Robert E. Howard and branched out into all things sword and sorcery. I have a personal blog, Silverkey, silverkey.blogspot.com, where you can check me out. Big fan of this stuff, role-playing games, the whole gamut. I'm very pleased to be here and honored to talk to you as well. I'm a big fan of your material.
Well, thank you. It's a real pleasure to have you here. It's a pleasure to finally meet you in person, as it were, and to see your awesome wall of books.
I know. This is a little bit of a brag. I'm just saying, I've actually read a few books. I got more going this way as well. I'll turn the camera around and we can all look at the spines of our books. And
nice.
Now, unfortunately, Jeff set all of his on fire. So
Fahrenheit 451.
What brought you here, Jeff?
Well, I once had a great library of books behind me, but as you can see, they have not survived the current situation. Dang you, 2020. But yes, so I am Jeff Goad. I've got a couple of podcasts. I'm on a podcast called Spellburn, which is the Dungeon Crawl Classics podcast. So Goodman Games and Spellburn have a close relationship because of Dungeon Crawl Classics. And Dungeon Crawl Classics is really the reason that I got into sword and sorcery. Because once I got into Dungeon Crawl Classics, I was like, you know what? I really need to be reading the Appendix N. So in New York, I started a meetup group called the DCC NYC Meetup Group. And as a part of that, I created the Appendix N Book Club, which was an in-person book club in Brooklyn, New York. Somebody's telling me to speak up. So I guess I'm not being very loud. Excuse me, sorry. So so in New York, I was running a book club called the Appendix N Book Club. And my buddy Hoy, who was showing up to each session, was like, you know what, we should do something with this. We should turn it into a book or a podcast or something. And since podcasting is what I already knew how to do, I went ahead and Hoy and I created the podcast, the Appendix N Book Club, where we're discussing a bunch of the authors who you may hear discussed this evening. And we've had amazing guests in the past, like Howard Andrew Jones and the author of the amazing Flame. They've both been on the show before. So thanks, guys, for being on the show.
Yeah. I appreciate the subliminal advertising with the flames.
Being here with us tonight. Let's move on to Jason then.
All right. Well, first, thanks a lot for including me on the panel. My name is Jason Ray Carney. I teach literature at Christopher Newport University in Newport News, Virginia. It's about an hour away from Richmond. My focus is popular literature. I teach, most of the time I teach 18th century Gothic novel. I hear a little bit of an echo. You guys hear that?
Yes, that's
yeah.
Someone is not muting their Twitch feed. No worries.
Okay, but really into sword and sorcery. Really into Robert E. Howard fandom. I wrote an academic book, and there's a chapter on Robert E. Howard. Played a lot of Dungeons and Dragons, a lot of DCC. that's about it. Oh, and by the way, I'm very much like fanboying out right now because I'm a big fan of Howard's fiction and Brian's Flaming Crimson. So, an honor to be on the panel with you guys. So,
yeah.
Definitely.
And also, real quick, I did not realize that the Jason who was in this meeting is Jason Ray Carney. I'm excited to meet you as well. And we've actually been chatting because you're going to be on an upcoming episode. You're going to be an upcoming guest on our show.
absolutely, yeah.
Jason.
It's so funny. I did not make the connection. That Jason was that Jason.
That's me.
All right, cool.
Trying to settle some last minute technical issues here. Bill.
Yes, sir.
Bill Ward.
Am I your last minute technical issue?
I wanted to make sure everyone knew that Bill Ward is now the Tales from the Magician's Skull official online editor.
That's right.
Coming to you from deep in Mordor while wearing the One Ring.
Yes, it wouldn't do for you to get a good look at me now. Now that I'm in mid transformation and my role is web editor or whatever the official title is. Yeah, just a quick introduction. I'm, like you guys, I'm a fan of this material from way back. I grew up playing D&D and being interested in all things sort of fantasy and coming at it from different directions. I remember Appendix N as a kid and like, oh yeah, I'll add some of those authors to my Christmas list. So I've written some, I guess, criticism. I've done some reviews in the past. Maybe you've seen me at Howard's website. We did a Conan reread and some other rereads and read-alongs that we did for a while there. And other than that, I've published a little fiction in my day, and just a fan like the rest of you guys. So it's a pleasure to be here.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you, Bill. And what Bill can't say, he probably wouldn't say because he's actually a modest guy, is that I think he's one of the most brilliant essayists working today in the sword and sorcery genre.
Actually, I forgot that. You're right.
Involved in whatever I'm doing.
God, how awesome I am.
Well, thank you, Howard. It's very nice of you to say.
Well, here we are at the panel, and we're allegedly going to be telling everyone in under 2 hours what the very best sword and sorcery stories of the 20th century are. I realized after I got all of us together that none of us are particularly well versed on the last 5 to 10 years. I still have my finger on the pulse a little bit because, of course, I edit Tales from the Magician's Skull, but 10 years ago, I was reading everything and everybody, and I've just been too busy to do that lately. So we may set up a panel in the future. We'll be doing other conventions, probably in the sometime in the spring, and we will definitely focus on the very recent. But for now, let's start with the definition of sword and sorcery. If you want to go see what we've said about it before, there's a big essay I wrote over, many years ago, but it is still now at the Magician's Skull website. Hopefully Thorne can throw that up for everybody. But real quick, what's a quick thumbnail definition? What would you guys say?
Oh, gosh, I mean, I don't know. I can start here. It's hard to put it all in a thumbnail because there's a lot that goes into it. But well, first of all, you wrote an excellent post today in the Tales from the Magician's Skull. Your Kickstarter, one of your posts today was excellent. I thought hit the nail on the head. Would recommend any listeners of the panel today to check that out. But so there are many components, but I think, as I think about it, I try to get it. If I had to get it down to a thumbnail, I would say that it's a genre that grew out of the pulps. That's really, I think, what differentiates it from regular fantasy, the big fantasy, the broader genre. If you think about it coming, and people might have different opinions on this, and we can talk about it. And there is no one right answer. This is art, not science, as I like to say. But if you consider it to be the coming out of the head of Robert E. Howard, or maybe as I'll get into a little bit later, the Shadow Kingdom, his first story of Cull. That was a product of Weird Tales and that came out of that magazine. And it's got a lot of resin and residue from that magazine. You know, a lot of horror being published at the time. Farnsworth Wright was the editor. He was experimental. He allowed authors to really mix genres together, and they sort of put this genre together that combines, you know, pulpy action and horror, outsider type heroes. I know I'm going a lot more than a thumbnail here, but I think it really goes back to Weird Tales. There's a fascinating academic book that was recently Legacy of Weird Tales. Got it behind me here in my voluminous bookshelves. But it really opened my eyes to, you know, people think of arts and artistry as just coming out of the brain of an individual artist, but this really gives credit to that medium of the pulp magazine that gave birth to this. And it really, in my opinion, starts from there. And then you can get into the conventions, and you can get into the authors and some of the experimental work they did, and you get into your Libers and your Moorcocks. But I have to give credit to Weird Tales for being the originator.
Right. I mean, one way to look at it is to say, and I think it was Karl Edward Wagner who once said in one of the introductions to, I think it was the first Echoes of Valor volume. Basically, if you want to go back, maybe the guy who did it was the first one who really did sword and sorcery might have been Homer, or right?
Yeah.
Or the unknown writer of Beowulf. But really,
Yep.
Rudyard Howard's the guy who brought it all forward into the 20th century, with modern pacing and interlaced with more modern senses of horror. But of course, that should make it clear that he didn't just start from scratch. He built on things.
Yep.
And I thought we could spend just a few minutes talking about the predecessors. And everyone knows who I'm probably going to talk about, but I wondered if anyone else wanted to get in a few favorites before we get into Robert E. Howard and Leiber and all those.
Yeah, I might say something about the supernatural. I'm really intrigued by this idea of the supernatural as being necessarily like evil or transgressive in sword and sorcery, and I think that has to do with the fact that it's sword and sorcery is a like what Brian said, it's a between the wars phenomena. It has that period like in its genes. And so part of that is like you have to have a specific, understanding of reality. And one of the ways I've always understood sword and sorcery is it combines like realist adventure fiction, historical fiction, on the one hand, with the kind of cosmic horror that's being developed in Weird Tales. And so it's this confluence of like the real and the supernatural. And when the supernatural shows up in this realistic adventure fiction, it's going to scare the hell out of you. So I guess that's one way of the way I define it, is like it's a genre of where it holds in tension the real and the supernatural. I don't know.
I think that's really well said. Did anyone else want to chime in? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut off our discussion. Go ahead, Jeff.
I would love to, and I would love to piggyback off of what Jason is saying here. I feel like sword and sorcery is a subgenre of the fantasy genre. And I think a big difference between sword and sorcery and other things that we find in the fantasy genre is it really is kind of a rack focus on the micro instead of the macro. So instead of like we're looking at cosmic horror, but we're not looking at cosmic horror in the way that it affects the entire world. We're looking at it in the way that it affects a person, or like two people who are exploring a dungeon together. Like we really go really close into the individual and their experience of this thing. And I think that's one of the things that is really unique and interesting about sword and sorcery, is we really kind of get down to the individual level. Things like Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings. I'm not going to be a Tolkien basher. I think the Lord of the Rings is fantastic. I absolutely adore it. But in my mind, it's not sword and sorcery, because it's really looking at like the effects of like magic, kind of on like this kind of like global, or at least like very like expanded scale. where when we're looking at kind of our traditional sword and sorcery, and we're looking at like our Conans and our Fafhrd and Grey Mousers, like we're kind of looking at how just like an individual or how a pair of people are exploring these like strange and unknown things in the way that it affects them. So one of the things that I really dig about sword and sorcery is how kind of deeply personal it is, rather than kind of being this like expanded macro experience.
It's a great point, Jeff. And it doesn't take 7 volumes or 3 volumes or the fantasy trilogy to tell it, which is one of the things that drew me to it when I was young. I grew up in the 80s, and it was the post-Tolkien era, but gosh, everywhere you turned, it was Dragonlance, or it was Dennis McKiernan's Iron Tower trilogy, or it was Stephen Donaldson's leprous anti-hero there. It was everything was 3 books, 5 books, 7 books. You had to put the time in, and it got exhausting. And this subgenre really allows you to get in, have some fun, and get out. It's never a bad
1,200 pages.
That's right.
It's not only 7 books; each one is 1,200 pages.
I know. Each one's a phone book. Yeah.
I want to chime in. We can't see him raising a signal, but let me say real quick 2 things. First, that I think it's important to distinguish Lord of the Rings and Conan. A lot of people get confused. Well, they both have wizards and sorcery and swords. If you look at the birthplaces of them, one is kind of a descendant of European novels where there's a travel log and long, slow passages where you describe the weather and what people eat and what's going on. And occasionally a fight bursts out, or occasionally there's a conference scene. And I'm not deriding it. I've never been a huge fan of The Lord of the Rings, but I do like it. I especially am taken with a lot of the language. Whereas Robert E. Howard's sword and sorcery was birthed in the pulps. The pulps have to grab you from the get-go. You're standing at the magazine rack in 1930. You pick up the story in the magazine to see if you want it, and you have to be snared by the first couple of sentences, or you might go buy a different magazine. And then, of course, there's the point that around the 30s, we were talking kind of hard-boiled sense. We already touched upon that, Brian and Jeff. I think you kind of already said something about the essential gritty tone of it, right? Well, a lot of people, when I first started talking about, I don't know, a hard-boiled sense, they're like, oh yeah, like Conan's wearing a fedora. Well, there's a sense in these stories that life is hard. It's not a pampered prince wandering off to have an adventure. It's more day-to-day stuff, as Jason was saying. And Bill, did you want to say anything about that?
No, I mean, I think you guys have covered it very well. I mean, maybe the simplest way to state it is it's a pulp adventure story with a supernatural element, right? I mean, that's almost, sometimes I try to figure out what the irreducible sort of definition of it is. But then there's a million exceptions that that are readily apparent. But I think the emphasis on the pulp origins of it is important because you have the hard-boiled, unsentimental, both the outlook and in the style of the prose. You have to have pace. So these stories have to move. They have to grab you. That's not necessarily just nonstop action scenes, but there has to be a point. And also the notion that they're intimate and they're personal. They're micro level rather than macro level. I think, Jeff, you pointed that out, and Jason was making great points there as well. And I think one interesting thing is when you take cosmic horror and you reduce it down to that micro level, there's almost a paradox where instead of people being insignificant, a la H.P. Lovecraft, all of a sudden people are incredibly significant. Now, maybe you broke into that haunted mansion to steal a jewel, right? Maybe it's to impress a chick. Right? Maybe it's these totally sort of very mundane motivations, right? You're not a great king fighting to save a kingdom, but you confronted something that is wholly other, and you came out on the other side of it. Maybe you had to run away, maybe you fought it off, but somehow there's an element, I think, of heroism and sort of a recognition of the significance of an individual, even in the midst of a completely mundane or even a selfish sort of motivation to their story. So I think those elements playing off against each other is what makes it so special. It makes it different than other things.
I'm glad you touched on Lovecraft, Bill, because I don't want to carry on this discussion of definition of sword and sorcery for too much longer. But I think in some ways it's almost a reaction against some of the same stuff that Lovecraft was reacting to. So Lovecraft is writing this horror fiction as at the dawn of the sort of new scientific age, when we begin to realize how insignificant we are and how large the universe really is. One option is to completely freak out and worry about things we don't understand coming to destroy us, which, you know, that's, maybe it's not tentacled beasts from beyond, but, you know, the universe is vast and we're very small and pretty insignificant, right? And that was freaking people out. Well, one way is to describe horror. One way then is to accept the horror but fight anyway. And I think that's kind of what Howard is tapping into.
Right.
Howard Andrew Jones.
Yeah, and we're probably going to be recommending a lot of books throughout this panel session, but one of the ones that I would recommend is an amazing correspondence between Robert E. Howard and H.P. Lovecraft. Let's see if I can actually recall the name of the book. It's behind me here. A Means to Freedom. It's a two volumes published, I believe, by Hippocampus Press, if I'm correct, but it's all of their correspondence from the early 30s through Howard's death in 1936. It has almost every single letter, which is phenomenal. I mean, I can't speak more highly of this correspondence. If you want to see where sword and sorcery was born, and it touches on what you were just talking about, Howard, you know, it was, you know, Robert E. Howard was greatly influenced by H.P. Lovecraft, and he incorporated a lot of those elements into his stories. You see, you know, the serpent men, for example, from the Shadow Kingdom, and some of the tentacled beasts that he had, and you know, some of his stories. But it was a reaction to it, like whereas HPL, the characters were helpless and there was doom in the end. For Howard, they would fight back, and frequently did. It doesn't mean they always won, but they weren't powerless in the face of this horror and these old ones, these elder race from around Caring Universe.
Yeah, can I jump in here?
Of course.
So, like, for the Lovecraftian hero, the world is meaningless, the cosmos is meaningless, and, you know, best to just scream in horror and go away. The sword and sorcery, I'm using broad strokes here, but specifically with Robert E. Howard, I'm thinking of that story, The Striking of the Gaunt. The sword and sorcery hero is able to be the originator of their own meaning. You know, like they kind of author themselves.
They're existentialists.
Their life. It's like there's this philosopher. Gosh, I forget his name. Doesn't matter who his name is, but he makes a distinction between the meaning of life versus the meaning in life. There is no meaning of life, all right, in the modern world from like a secular perspective, but there can be meaning in life. Like, what do you do with the time you have? And you know, I think that's the concern of the sword and sorcery genre. Is, you know, like, I'm thinking of that Queen of the Black Coast, the famous Conan philosophy speech. He pretty much articulates that, like, whatever, I'm just here and I'm going to do my thing and let the teachers and philosophers figure out what it all means. I'm concerned with what it means to me. And I think it's a very much it's an ethos that kind of, it's not in all the sword and sorcery, you know, but it's definitely, it's a big part of it, I think. And I think it's a big part of its appeal, you know.
I also think what's interesting about that too is I feel like Conan and sword and sorcery is kind of grappling with this idea of what does it mean to be somebody who is potentially like wiping out these like unknown mysteries from previous times, where in Lovecraft you're the one being wiped out by these unknown mysteries from the past. In sword and sorcery, you're the one who's kind of wiping out these things. You're encountering these things that are totally unknowable to the modern day human brain. And because it is threatening our well-being, we kill it to get rid of it, but then it's gone. And that was the last vestige of this thing that existed in our universe. But to protect ourselves, we had to destroy it. So it also feels like it's kind of this like interesting kind of like grapple with what it means to kind of be a human, kind of working with like colonialism and kind of exploring what it means to be destroying one culture as we move into our own. There seems like there's a lot of interesting stuff happening there on kind of a psychic level underneath it all.
Yeah, almost destroying magic itself in a way when you think about it. I mean, they're sort of bringing, they're kind of rationalizing the irrational with a sword. So it's interesting.
Oh, that's
absolutely
awesome.
Yeah, I like that.
Rationalizing the irrational with a sword. Wow.
Right. So, someone write that down.
Yeah.
Well, here we are. It's 5:30. Let's move on to discussion of some of the great works. But like I said, I don't think we probably need to mention Homer and the Beowulf, but let's talk about some of the fiction that people would find of interest. Who wants to go? Bill?
We're talking about pre-sword and sorcery influences?
Sorcery. What was inspiring Robert E. Howard and Catherine L. Moore and others?
Well, I mean, I won't even talk about Harold Lamb. Somebody is a little bit more capable in that department. But obviously the historical adventure pulps were half of the equation, really. And then I think it was also cosmic horror, in particular, the weird tale sort of encounter with the unknown. That, I mean, you could say that tradition, well, it started much earlier than Edgar Allan Poe, but I think he's kind of credited as the first sort of weird tale sort of author. But yeah, I mean, I think those
guys.
What's that?
Ambrose Bierce, for instance, and
well, exactly, or Algernon Blackwood and all that tradition that kind of grew up in the late 19th and early 20th century. That's all the sort of thing that Howard and other people would be reading to be influenced by, and I would, and even well, Edgar Rice Burroughs, right? John Carter of Mars is 1912. I mean, it's and Tarzan. And I'm sure those were also an influence. Probably any sort of adventure fiction of that era out of the pulps.
Right, and it's got to be mentioned. Some people put such strict definitions and all this stuff.
Right.
Tarzan's, well, that's a Jungle Man story. Yes, it's pretty out there. It's not really. It's fantasy, right?
Right. Yes.
Heroic fiction. It's a guy braving incredible dangers and doing amazing things out there. And then, of course, the John Carter of Mars books.
Right.
Is it science fiction?
I'd say that's a fantasy too. You know, I mean, that's
possible. It's science fantasy.
Right.
And fantasy is pretty darn closely related to sword and sorcery.
Mm-hmm.
I think you have to mention too H. Rider Haggard,
mm-hmm.
who with She.
Absolutely.
Gosh,
that's
yes, and it's got the whole angle of the lost city, which we see a lot in the Howard stories. It's a recurring motif there. A story that actually, Jeff, you just covered on the Appendix N podcast, The Ship of Ishtar.
Abraham Merritt.
A Merritt, yeah, was another one that is I mean, it's basically sword and sorcery, right? It's like maybe the framing, though, if you want to get technical, the framing device, you have a modern day scientist who's a portal fantasy, I guess, if you could technically call it, if you want to say that, and maybe that excludes it from sword and sorcery, but it's everything but
and sword and sorcery.
That's right.
Exclude. I think if we make the barriers too thick and the borderlines too exact, we begin arguing about angels and heads of pins and such.
Yeah,
that's right.
Exactly. It becomes a semantical conversation rather than anything of substance.
Yeah.
But yeah, absolutely. I feel like all the people you guys have mentioned so far are absolutely proto sword and sorcery. The two names that I would want to add to the list would be Edgar Allan Poe and Lord Dunsany. I feel like both of them are also very
definitely
important to the development of sword and sorcery, especially Lord Dunsany. You know, looking at his individual's tales, like they don't feel like a Conan story. They don't feel like a Fafhrd and Grey Master story, but they're still kind of grappling with a lot of the interesting elements that we have there. So I feel like both of those names are also important to be discussed. And especially when we're talking about Dunsany, I feel like the gods of Pagana and kind of the way he approached kind of his mythos, I think was so inspirational to H.P. Lovecraft that it really kind of, I think then set kind of Howard and Clark Ashton Smith down a very specific path that I think really kind of shaped the way that like Lovecraft looked at cosmic horror, and then the way that Howard and Clark Ashton Smith then started to look at sword and sorcery.
That's a great point.
Yeah. I'm sorry.
We've run through a couple of names. Let's quickly recommend things before we move forward. And Jason, will come to you. What did you think of Ship of Ishtar, guys? Is it a classic that people still need to be reading?
I think so. I loved it. I mean, it's heroic. It's fast moving. It's got a great framing device. It's interesting. I forget who mentioned it. Someone mentioned earlier on the panel session here that maybe it was you, Jason, that sword and sorcery is sort of the product of an era between two wars. And the guy, his name is John Kenton, if I'm correct, is the hero, the protagonist of Ship of Ishtar, and he is a traumatized World War I veteran. And I actually think there's something to that. You know, Howard talked a lot about that in his letters, where he talked about the damaging effect of World War I, the effect of modernism, just mass slaughter on the battlefield, and how heroic fantasy, sword and sorcery could bring back the efficacy of the individual to all this, where it was just totally gone on a modern day battlefield. But yeah, Ship of Ishtar, amazing. You know, it's a guy from the modern era who's put back into a heroic age and kicks some ass. I mean, frankly, it still reads well, it moves well. It's got some dated elements, and I'm sure we could talk about, on this panel too, the some of the problematic elements of sword and sorcery. It does have that, the way it portrays some races and so forth, but for like action, adventure, there's an amazing scene where he's sitting in a drab gray office, and then he gets whisked picks up this cube, and he gets put on the ship hat. It's half black, half white. And there's this beautiful woman, Shireen, and it just explodes into color. Like it's an amazing contrast. Got to read that one.
And I should say, throw this in here. All of these earlier writers, they weren't working from a template like we see so often happening today, where you can refer to a monster manual and say, oh, that's a this kind of book. That's a this kind of goblin, whatever. These guys and gals were wildly inventive, especially if you turn around and look at something like Lord Dunsany, but Merritt was similar in a way. Ideas just came bubbling, and they're all wild and colorful and inventive. Now, we mentioned Haggard. Were there any Haggard stories or books that you think that we ought to definitely recommend to everybody?
Let's see, Haggard. I mean, I would have to recommend. I mean, you got to read King Solomon's Mines is probably his most classic. And then I'd have to say Saga of Eric Brighteyes, which is my favorite Haggard work. I mean, it's basically a Icelandic saga with a modern reinterpretation.
Eric Brighteyes.
Saga of Eric Brighteyes. It might just be called Eric Brighteyes. I can't recommend it more highly. Again, it's a reinterpretation of a Icelandic saga for a modern audience. Phenomenal.
I appreciate that, Thorne. I wanted to make sure that we didn't forget talking about Haggard, and let's see, we also mentioned Algernon Blackwood and Dunsany and Bierce. So I wanted to recommend some
Clark Ashton Smith.
Yeah, well, we'll get to him. We're going to cover him.
We'll get to-
Yeah. So, Lord Dunsany, I think some of my favorites from Dunsany are The Sword of Welleran, The Fall of Babelkund, and The Book of Wonder. Honestly, these are all in the little collection called The Sword of Welleran. And I love just about everything in there, but directly related to Sword and Sorcery are those three. And then from the Book of Wonder, you've got The Horde of the Gibelins.
That's a good one. I love that.
I would also like to add, if possible, I just threw into the Twitch chat, I just sent everybody a link. I'm Dayog the Blue, if you see that in there, to a Gutenberg link of the Gods of Pagana stories written by Lord Dunsany. Each story is maybe 4 paragraphs. Like, really, it is, you cannot have a more bite-sized example of like proto sword and sorcery than Lord Dunsany's Gods of Pagana. Like the what's the unicorn one? I love it. What's King of Elfland, Queen of Elfland's. Wait, King of Elfland. I'm confusing it with the Goodman Games title now.
The King of is it the King of Elfland's daughter? It is the King of Elfland's daughter.
King of Elfland's daughter is fantastic. But go to Gods of Pagana and you have these like stories that are 4 paragraphs long and they are so evocative and I feel like really tell you everything you need to know about Lord Dunsany.
And I have to recommend one more. The Fortress, I'm probably going to screw it up. The Fortress Unvanquishable, save for Sacknoth. It's a mouthful, but some people say that was the first sword and sorcery story. In fact, I'll shamelessly plug my own book again. I have a little sidebar about that. I'll do this frequently throughout this panel, but it's basically sword and sorcery. I mean, it is sword and sorcery. It's just, you know, the question is, did that launch the sword and sorcery subgenre? I would argue no, but basically it is. It's an amazing, tight little story. It's a warrior going to kill a wizard who's invulnerable, and he has to go and kill a dragon first, and then tackle the wizard next. And it's got all the elements there. It's so well done. I mean, Dunsany is just an amazing author. No one, I don't know if anyone does prose better than Dunsany.
My favorite Dunsany.
Can I say something about Horde of the Gibelins?
Yeah.
It's well, in your book, Flame and Crimson, you mention Walter Benjamin and the disenchantment of the world. Like, basically, like with World War I, you had all of these young Europeans going to war. They had this vision of like, this is going to be just like, you know, the Napoleonic Wars. It's going to be this romantic thing. And then they get the trenches and it's completely disenchanted. If you read The Horde of the Gibelins, I don't mean to spoil. I'm going to spoil it. I don't care.
It's a 100-year-old book.
If you haven't read it by now, it's short. It's still beautiful, even if you know. But it's about this knight's quest. It sets you up to think he's going to do what knights do. You know, beat the Gibelins, steal their treasure, and it's a complete failure. And he's just killed at the end. And I think like part of Sword and Sorcery is this disenchanted thing. You know, we talked about the Ship of Ishtar. Like, it starts in this drab place, and then he goes into this vivid, you know, colorful world. There's something about disenchantment and enchantment going on. Like, I think Sword and Sorcery is a kind of narrative art that re-enchants the world.
Yeah.
At least for the duration of holding it in your hands, you're kind of your whatever has happened after World War I, you know, is kind of restored for a little bit, or maybe not. You know, I don't know. Right.
Yeah, I would agree, Jason. And I don't think it's a coincidence that it was written in the era it was, and that it was revived in the 60s shortly, you know, during Vietnam. You know, that's pure speculation, but, you know, you got to look at the broader historical context and where this stuff came from and say maybe there was a link there.
Yeah. That's all I do is speculate. I'm not a scientist.
I like that.
I make no apology for speculation.
That's all any of us are doing. So
that's right. We just make it up.
Algernon Blackwood and Ambrose Bierce. I'm a big fan of Ambrose Bierce, but I think if there was only one that you should read, it would be The Damned Thing, which is just a great horror. How about Algernon Blackwood? I haven't explored him as thoroughly. He did some pretty horrific things. Anyone have a favorite they want to recommend from him?
Well, and we haven't mentioned Chambers yet either.
Oh my goodness, how could we forget Chambers?
Algernon Blackwood, the Willows. I'd
Yeah.
have to recommend that one. That is scary as hell. It's so atmospheric and creepy. Like really nothing happens, but he scares the bejesus out of you in that story. Read The Willows if you don't read anything else.
Famous for The King in Yellow because it's almost the only fantasy story he wrote. I know Lynn Carter unearthed a few more that are sort of related, but anyone want to tackle The King in Yellow? Discuss why it's so awesome.
I usually don't think about Chambers in the context of sword and sorcery, but now that you bring it up, like so much of the trope of the sorcerer comes from these cosmic horror. Like I think of Chambers when Lovecraft, he's obviously an influence on Lovecraft, like the unreadable text, but a lot of that shows up in sword and sorcery in the image of the sorcerer. But that's fine. The character trope of the sorcerer.
Well, why don't we shift over to a few questions? I think we can all see here that people were asking if there's a difference between heroic fantasy and sword and sorcery. In my mind, heroic fiction is just a broader definition. So, for instance, I would throw in Tarzan and his knockoff Kygor and the Edgar Rice Burroughs novels and all kinds of stuff like that. Probably some really awesome historic fiction I could throw into the pot as heroic fiction as well. Whereas sword and sorcery kind of has to have sorcery in it. Not necessarily on a secondary world. I know some people say, oh, sword and sorcery has to be in an imaginary world, but I've never completely bought that. Anyone else want to chime in on the difference?
Well, just building on what you just said there, I would argue it either has to be in a secondary world or in our own prehistory. But I don't really know that sword and sorcery and historic fiction really have a strong overlap, unless you guys strongly disagree with that, and I would love to hear it.
I strongly disagree.
Please, Howard. I want to hear it.
As far as the historical fiction, I think it was a huge influence in what happened in sword and sorcery.
I'm not saying it's not an influence. I'm saying that sword and sorcery and historical fiction are two different genres, and that there's very little, if no, overlap.
No, I think that well, if you take a look at Lamb in particular, you could see his Cossack stories, for instance. He could change it instead of putting it on Earth and put it on Mongaria instead of Mongolia. Mm-hmm. And it would read like a fantasy story, and occasionally give someone a fantastic monster to fight rather than a monster, and it would read perfectly as sword and sorcery. And you can see how easy it is to adapt a Robert E. Howard historical fiction story just turn it into a Conan story, as was done by Roy Thomas and before him, Camp and Lynn Carter less successfully.
How dare you?
How dare you? Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, I think from the right mindset, they're very similar in their outlook, just without the sorcery. The right kind of historical fiction, but not all historical fiction is going to read that way. It depends on if it reads as heroic fiction. It's just one step to the left, kind of like Time Warp, I guess.
That's a step to the right.
The heroic fantasy question, I mean, I don't know if heroic fantasy has really been adequately defined ever. I think it was more of a catch-all term. It's a much broader, I think it might have been you, Jeff, that said that. It's just sort of sword and sorcery. It probably encompasses sword and sorcery. It can fit in there. I tend to use it for stories that are a little bit unclassifiable, that have a lot of sword play, a lot of heroics, but aren't necessarily, I guess maybe one distinction to draw, maybe heroic fantasy is perhaps not pulp fiction and weird tales derived. Like I think of a story like E.R. Edison's The Worm or Ouroboros, which is pre-weird tales written in the early 20s, I believe. But it's about valor and battles, and it does have magic in it, but it's set on another planet, Mercury, and probably something you wouldn't call sword and sorcery. It's novel length. It's sort of got a little bit of that old travelogue, William Morris in it a little bit, but a lot, still pretty action, fast paced, combat heavy.
It has an old time feel to it, but once you get used to the prose, it's a little bit of a slog getting used to it. I found, of course, it's been 20 years since I read it. But once you get over that, and the fact that the two nations are called witches and demons, but they aren't really witches or demons, and it's once you get past that and just kind of get wrapped up in the prose, it's just really interesting, and engaging heroic story.
I love it. It's the language is a little bit archaic for the modern reader, but it's phenomenal. That's another one I recommend.
And in the Twitch chat, Barbarian Luke is saying it was the preferred term of Lynn Carter, right? I.e. flashing swords, etc. And I feel like there was a point where there were all these people who were really emotionally and economically invested in these stories doing well, and they were looking for branding. How do we brand these kinds of stories? So we had the Elsbreg de Camps and the Lynn Carters, who were originally kind of trying to brand them as heroic fantasy. But then we kind of had Fritz Leiber and Micah Moorcock, who then kind of glommed onto more this brand of sword and sorcery. And heroic fantasy, I think, fits, as you guys were saying, a larger category. But I feel like Michael Moorcock and Fritz Leiber did a great job of really kind of glomming onto kind of the more specific thing that we're talking about and that we're really excited about, which is sword and sorcery. And to me, that's the difference between the two. Sword and sorcery is absolutely a smaller subset of the overall heroic fantasy.
Thank you, Jim.
Works for me.
Yeah, that really.
I hope I'm not embarrassing Howard by bringing up his fiction, but I would sometimes categorize your Hanover stories as a heroic fantasy and sword and sorcery at the same time. The Desert of Souls as did I get that name correct? Desert of Souls, Desert of Eternity, Desert of Souls.
Desert
right?
of Souls.
I'm sorry. The protagonists are heroes. They're selfless. They're driven forward by an ethic. Right, like a system of values, rather than I know it's a broad stroke, but a lot of times the sword and sorcery hero has kind of been set up in these conversations as being mercenary and self-centered. So this is a personal distinction I make, is I sometimes if the character is heroic, if it's somebody that I would want to be then it's a heroic fantasy. But if it's someone that is, does that make sense? I don't know.
No, it does.
Yeah. And then we had another question here. Would S&S exist if novel-length fiction was king of the pulse?
Wow.
No.
Just a flat no. Never.
I mean, I feel like the reason why sword and sorcery really kind of exploded the way it did is I feel like it was really kind of the king of the format that was popular at its time. I feel like there's a reason why the really bloated fantasy fiction became really popular around the same time that we developed the technology for really thick paperback novels. I feel like one speaks to the technology that existed at the time and another speaks to a different technology that existed at the time. Personally, for me, kind of the shorter, more action-packed, succinct stories speak to me more. But I think it's kind of clear looking at once we had the technology for these ginormous stories, people really glommed onto that.
Yeah. No, I think, again, that I mentioned it earlier in the call, Weird Tales, but, sword and sorcery benefited greatly because it had, to be blunt, it had a paid medium for the authors to work in. That's important. A lot of these guys were making a living writing this stuff, and they had the mechanism to do it. You had Weird Tales, then you had magazines like Unknown. John Campbell published that one in the 40s. You had Fantastic, you had Other Worlds, you had Weird Book, Whispers, Dragon Magazine, even the fantasy role-playing game would publish Sword and Sorcery, Gardner Fox. Without that medium, I don't know if it would have taken off like it did. I mean, these guys could carve out a living. Robert E. Howard was had a couple of years where he was making as much money as anyone in his town, almost small town of Cross Plains. And then you had the paperback boom, as you just mentioned, Jeff, and that allowed it to move into a new medium. I don't think it ever really fit as well in that medium. Now, you had some great anthologies, great paperback anthologies, which we can talk about. And you had some sword and sorcery authors that were able to bridge that divide and start writing longer form. But I still feel like its sweet spot is the novella, the short story, and its classic stuff is short stories or anthologized.
I tend to agree. I think the pacing and the short, vivid style has an awful lot to do with sword and sorcery. It can be done at longer length. I think David Jamel could do it at longer length, and some other people do it. God knows I'm trying to do it at longer length. Modern readers seem to want longer length.
Well, to plug your magazine, Howard, that's why, Tales from the Magician's Skull and Whetstone. It's so important to have a place for modern writers to be able to work and maybe make a few bucks, but at least at minimum get exposure. Critical. It's the sword and sorcery wouldn't have survived, wouldn't have begun without Weird Tales. Howard spent half of his life trying to break into the higher paying, historicals, and went into, Magic Carpet and was trying other markets. He stayed with Weird Tales because it was the best paying, and Conan was sort of his meal ticket. But the opportunity had to be there, and he needed the money. He was a working writer.
Yes, I very much wish he could have cracked Argosy or Adventure.
Right, I know.
Well, we've got an interesting question here about the problematic aspects of sword and sorcery. I was wanting to stick more with the history first, but you know what? This was going to come up eventually. So why don't we tackle that head on? The question is, what about some of the problematic aspects of sword and sorcery, like race and depiction of women? I sometimes feel like I have to defend Howard and Conan. There are definitely problems with his writing, but nothing like HPL. Thoughts?
Well, that's a big one.
I have many thoughts, but I don't know.
There goes the next hour.
Yeah, Bill, would you like Bill, would you like to go before I share my thoughts?
Not really. I don't. I think, like I say, there goes the next hour. I think we could talk endlessly about this, but it is a question of context, and it is a you could put something from 1933 under a microscope and go all day over it, or you could mention someone like Charles Saunders, who said, you know what, I saw that things were being done a little differently than I would prefer, and I went out and showed him how it was done. You know what I mean? And that's sword and sorcery. It's an evolving genre, right? Like anything else. And it's, getting all upset about somebody from the 1930s thinking like the 1930s, and ignoring what's come afterwards and what is actually the central core of the genre is, it's just kind of getting lost, in the forest despite the trees.
Getting lost. I think that's really well said. I mean,
it is, but I would also I would agree, and I would agree in some ways and disagree in others. Absolutely, they are all products of their time, and in some ways, it is completely unfair to judge somebody who is writing in the 1930s from a 2020 perspective. Absolutely, I agree with you 100%. However, when you also look at somebody like H.P. Lovecraft, who, if you look at his poem on the creation of N-word, if you Google that poem, you will be shocked at the way that he viewed Black people. His view of Black people was not just him being a product of his time. He really, truly believed that Black people were subhuman. And also, I want to point out that this is entirely a panelist of white men, and a group of white men discussing whether or not Black people or women should have any right to be upset about what was written in 1930 is not really our place to discuss. But I will say, absolutely, for many of these stories, when we're reading it from a 2020 perspective, a lot of it is very challenging to read, which is why from the very beginning of the Appendix N book club, Hoy and I'm a gay person, Hoy is a person of color, and we very specifically were discussing 3 specific points in our episode 0 of our podcast. We wanted to talk about how, one, we're not going to apologize for these authors and act as though what they're saying isn't actually a problem. The other thing is we're not going to tell you not to read these people because of these things. We're not going to say, oh, you need to boycott H.P. Lovecraft because of his racism. But the third thing is we are absolutely going to talk about the things what it's like to read these things from a contemporary perspective. And I think it's really important when we are acknowledging the importance of these things and talking about them, that we also recognize how challenging it is for a Black person to read these kinds of stories, and how challenging it is for a woman to read these kinds of stories, because the depictions of women and people of other races, especially Black people, can be very challenging when you read these stories.
I'm going to give you a golf clap there. I remember when my daughter was young, and I was having to. Some people were upset with me when I was saying yes, there's sexism in some of these other stories. People were sort of attacking me for that when I was talking about it. I'm like, well, you know, have you ever tried explaining to your 10-year-old who loves fantasy stories why that one might not be a good idea, or why so many of them might not be a good idea because the women don't have any empowerment, they don't have any. It's not like you should throw out the entire genre. You should find the awesome things that are there, but you also need to be aware of the things that aren't there, and some of the stuff that is, that kind of leaves you a little cringy now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Jason.
Well, when I have a lot of students who like Dungeons and Dragons, and I'm kind of getting a reputation as being like the fantasy fact professor, the weird. I'll tell them, like, there's some racist and sexist shit in here. Just be aware. And that's pretty much how I introduce the 1930s pulp stuff to them. I'm not saying that we haven't had the hard conversations, but I won't dominate this, but I do think if you compare high fantasy with sword and sorcery, there's some good that sword and sorcery does. If you think about like Tolkien, it's a macro culture. I think I'm stealing that term from Howard on a conversation I had with you. It's like, you think about, like, it's the elves and then the men of the Dunedain, and then everything is part of the same culture. Even the Dark Lord. Oh my gosh, Sauron is part of the same culture, the same mythology. In Sword and Sorcery, in Howard's Sword and Sorcery, it's a pluralistic culture. Of course, there's violent contact between the cultures, but at least difference is represented. In Tolkien, what you do is you change difference and you turn it into a monster. Difference becomes an orc, and you kill the orc, right? Where in Sword and Sorcery, you have there's difference. There is a what's a culture? A Stygian, right? But at least that Stygian still has their humanity. There might be an a-hole, but they're human. And I think there's something about that. I think it's a difference between Sword and Sorcery as an American fantasy genre that kind of has at its core this, like, very violent conflict of many different cultures. But that's actually a good thing, because that's part of our, like, American experiment. So I don't want to come up like I'm being a jingoistic, like we America stuff, but at the same time, I mean, what I'm trying to say, like, it's different than high fantasy. High fantasy just takes the different person and says, you're a monster and I now kill you. Sword and Sorcery doesn't do that. You kill, but
yeah, you have the orcs in Tolkien and so forth.
Tolkien is not living in the land of those people. He is living in England and hearing about these colonial places. So it's easy to make the orc the other and not have them not give them human characteristics when they are in some distant land that you're just reading about. Whereas Howard is living in Texas, And Howard is living in Texas in the 1930s. And Howard is seeing how what we have done, how that has affected the humanity of other beings. So I think that's a really intelligent and astute observation in terms of heroic fantasy versus, or epic fantasy versus sword and sorcery, and how it relates to the other.
And I want to get back to recommending stories, but I want to comment on one other thing. As far as Robert E. Howard's alleged sexism, let's face it, he had a lot of the women in his stories were about as useful as Bond girls from the 60s and 70s. However, he was perfectly capable of writing enabled women, and I think he would have written a lot more of them if the market would have taken it. For instance, Dark Agnes. He wrote two pretty cool stories about Dark Agnes as the protagonist, a woman, swordswoman, in was it 16th or 17th century France.
17th.
He couldn't sell them. He stopped halfway through the third one because no one would publish them. He said, just sell more, Doug. But sometimes the market has something to do with what's happening. The market also had to do, it was typical, unfortunately, of the pulps to do a shorthand quick, oh, this race is like that race is like this, etc., etc. And unfortunately, a whole bunch of the fiction of that time has those sticking points and those aspects. It's not just the sword and sorcery guys. It's some other fiction, most of the fiction from that time. You read Chandler uses terms. I've heard some people go, well, I'm not going to read Chandler because he's a racist. Well, Raymond Chandler's a freaking amazing writer. But he tosses some terms around that aren't used in polite society anymore. What do you do? Do you stop reading a person because they do that? Do you think, well, do you just try to separate the text from the writer? I try to separate the text from the writer, but then you can't just look at this period and judge everything from our period because we've got everything right. Well, maybe we don't.
Right. That's the bigger question. You know, it's like my favorite movie is Rosemary's Baby, but I also recognize that the filmmaker Rosemary's Baby is a child rapist. You know, and it's like for some people that means I'm not watching any movies made by this man. And I totally get that. For me, though, it's still my favorite movie. So whether you can separate the art from the artist is an individual question that only you can answer for yourself. Nobody can tell you whether or not you can or should separate the art from the artist.
And I think these were also three-dimensional figures. These are real human beings. And if you look at Howard's life and what he did over the course of his life, you know, he wrote stories about a black boxer, Ace Jessel, who was the protagonist. He had a black man as a protagonist of his boxing stories. I know we're getting outside of sword and sorcery there, and he had some strong female characters. He did write some stuff that would be very, very offensive to a reader. You know, you look at maybe his early Solomon Kane stuff and some of his other stories had some really problematic elements. But it's not as black and white, as simple as it looks at first glance.
In Solomon Kane, you might cringe at this, and then you see that one of the coolest characters in there is Nalanga.
Right.
And Nalanga also talks with the pidgin accent. So, you know.
Yeah.
But I like what Jeff said. Everyone has their own toleration point. Yep.
No doubt.
All right. Well, back to discussing the fiction. We haven't even gotten to talking.
I know.
Well, the stories that we'd recommend. And I just wanted to hit up real quick on how awesome Harold Lamb is.
Mm-hmm.
And how influential Lamb was in the creation of sword and sorcery, because you read him and it has almost all the elements that Robert E. Howard turned into sword and sorcery, except for the sorcery in the imaginary world. Headlong plots, surprises, sword play, mystery, quotes at the heads of chapters from historical sources rather than imaginary historical sources. I just find that it's splendid stuff. And I would recommend, if you've heard about Lamb and haven't tried him, try the first volume of the four contact books, Wolf of the Steppes. And you ought to at least try reading The Mighty Manslayer or Chang and Nor, although Gosh, if I were you, I'd try to start at the top, even though the first one or two aren't nearly as strong as the ones that follow. And if Crusaders are more your thing, there's Swords from the West. Fall all of the steps.
Those are tomes.
Yeah. The second one is Swords from the West. And man, this is full of great Crusader stories. But again, if you just want to have one or two that's recommended from there, there's a really short one called Protection. There's the short novel, The Grand Cam, or the other short novel, The Making of the Morning Star. They're both in here. And then there are the two novels about a guy named Neil O'Gordon, Keeper of the Gate and the Golden Horde. And they're just fabulous. You can totally see why Robert E. Howard would have been inspired by this guy.
Yep.
All right. Speaking of Robert E. Howard, let's finally get around to talking about Robert E. Howard and Clark Ashton Smith, and then on to some of the others. What's so great about Robert E. Howard?
I don't even know where to start there. I mean, I have two of his stories on my list, and I could have 10. I mean, the guy could just write propulsive fiction that would pull you along, and natural storyteller, I think, is probably his greatest strength as a writer. I mean, he's got many. He was just a talent. You know, I'm convinced you can make a really good writer out of most people. You absolutely can. It's one of those skills like playing a guitar. You put your 10,000 hours in, you can become a good writer. But he just seemed, his very first story, Spear and Fang, which was published when he was 18. Now it's not as polished or as well done as something like The Tower of the Elephant, but my gosh, it just pulls you right in immediately. It's just a visceral story. And it just shows the talent that he had at a very young age, and everything. He wrote over 300 stories in his short lifespan. I got to go with the Shadow Kingdom though. And I'll Howard, I'm going to do what you did. I'll just flash some covers here. If you want to, you know, there are many places to find the Shadow Kingdom, and you can actually read it for free on Gutenberg. But this is the Del Rey edition. These are the Ballantine books. This is the unadulterated actual stories. You know, no L. Sprague de Camp interference or pastiche intermingled here. These are the real deal. This particular one, and I'm going to plug a guy if you don't mind. Steve Tompkins, he wrote the introduction. Steve passed away in 2009, but for my money, I think Steve Tompkins was probably the most interesting and astute essayist I have come across in sword and sorcery circles. The guy, his essays are so dense, full of allusion, metaphor. The guy was beyond well read, and he left. You know, he passed away far too early. I think he was 48 or 49 when he passed. But he wrote the introduction to Exile of Atlantis, and you got to go with the Shadow Kingdom. I mean, this is the one that started it all. You've got Kull the Barbarian. You got an outsider on the throne. He's battling serpent men. By the way, I'm going to say out loud, Kanama Ka Lajarma. Anyone turn to a serpent man? I'm just looking around here. I'm not sure if Bill might have.
I mean,
That's why he hasn't had his camera on.
He is right now a serpent-headed man.
Dedicated Swords from the West to Steve. Dedicated, yeah, right there.
Yeah. You got to find his essays. I actually, he would have turned 60 the other day, and I wrote a little post for DMR, which maybe we'll get into the very end of the panel. DMR Publishing, and they Deuce Richardson, who's an editor, site editor over there, published just a long list of all the essays he's written. Steve had written over the years. Check them out.
I'm sorry I cut you out. Yeah, DMR did have some wonderful posts celebrating Steve, and it's a shame that he's not here still with us writing these wonderful essays.
Yeah.
Thrilled by the growing interest in sword and sorcery. All right, my gosh, it's already 6:15. We have so many other things to talk about. You know, my favorites, Bill and I did a whole reread of the Conan stories, and I think Tower of the Elephant, Black Colossus are two of our very favorites, along with People of the Black Circle, and of course the hour length, Tower of the Dragon. And so many people.
I would second Tower of the Elephant. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Like if I had to pick a favorite Howard, that might be my favorite.
I think I'm with you, Jeff. It's right. It's top 2 or 3 without question.
Yeah, I'd have to agree there. I would recommend Hour of the Dragon as an introduction to Howard, only because so many people these days are novel readers rather than short fiction readers. So I kind of think and it was written as an introduction to the character, which is also in its favor. But I would definitely say the Tower of the Elephant is sort of a quintessential. It's almost like the platonic ideal of a Conan story, and it's got everything in it. But there's also the quintessential sword and sorcery novel of Conan, and that's The Hour of the Dragon, or Conan the Conqueror is also what it's called. And I think if anyone out there is looking to get into Conan, that is a really great place to start, because I think it would feel familiar to a lot of modern readers, and it's sort of a trip through time for the Conan character as he goes back into his past. He's lost his kingdom, he has to regain it. He goes back through really almost through his past lives, revisiting his time as a mercenary and as a pirate captain and things like that. So I think that's sort of a really good place to start for anyone that's wondering.
Yeah, I agree. Can I mention a non-Conan one?
Absolutely.
Absolutely not. No.
Oh.
I always ask.
Somebody boot him from this call.
The James Allison story, The Valley of the Worm.
Oh yeah.
It has some of the, it's a weird way of putting it, but some of the most beautiful descriptions of violence in all of Howard's writing. Like there's this one description of the battle where like a woman and child are going down. They're like villagers of this really strong, barbarian tribe, pre-modern tribe. And they're like biting the conquerors as they're dying. Like it's really creepy and sublime. It's dark, but it's a literary experience that has stuck with me for a while. So The Valley of the Worm is a James Allison story.
I also like Howard's James Allison story, Garden of Fear is another of my favorites. I mean, if we're going to talk about non-Conan stories, I've got a list as long as my arm of other stuff that I like by him, including his historicals, and I have 5 or 6 that are among my favorites of him. But I guess we should stick with the sword and sorcery part. So, like Cull, The Shadow Kingdom, Kings of the Night, which also has in it, The Dark Man, and Worms of the Earth.
Yeah, really, all of the Bran McMorn is just fantastic.
Yeah, Worms of the Earth is probably top 5. I don't even know. It's too hard.
Yeah,
I'm not going to do that. I refuse.
Everyone's heard of Robert E. Howard, and everyone's more familiar with him. So we've shared some titles. So why don't we talk about Clark Ashton Smith, who gets talked about a lot, but isn't as widely available. So why don't we talk about the best stories from him and where people should start if they want to approach his.
Oh.
Am I allowed to swear? Because what I'm about to say would involve a swear word. Am I allowed to say that?
Absolutely. Oh, I think.
I don't know.
I'll let Howard say it.
I don't know what's happening. Okay. Well, if you want to read about some good, as my friend Andy Markham would say, some good mummy fucking, you should absolutely read any of the Zothique stories. Like there is so much mummy fucking in Smith Zothique stories. But like Necromancers and Not is a fantastic story. But there's a lot of like these like weird wizards having sex with dead things. But I highly recommend those stories.
Yeah, a lot of necrophilia.
Yeah.
I have to go with and I'm gonna again pull up I go back to the original. This was from Nightshade Books. This is The Collected Fantasies of Clark Ashton Smith, Volume 1.
Those are
yeah, I've got 3 of the 5. I've got a few others besides, but there's a particular story in here called The Tale of Satampra Zeros, which is really pure sword and sorcery. You've got, it's It's actually a little bit different than the Howard strain, very different, you know, because the hero is not much of a hero at all. He's a thief. He's on a botched temple raid. They go in thinking they're going to have an easy heist. They're walking to an old, dilapidated city where there's some rumored treasure. They kind of get shit-faced on the way in there, which is hilarious. They're drinking everything because they have no money and they decide to go for wine instead of bread. But the whole raid is botched. Satamprazeros, his friend, is killed by this creature. He's chased out. He loses his hand. But it's got all the great stuff that you love about Clark Ashton Smith. It's got the ornate prose. It's got the wonderful descriptions and atmosphere. But definitely sword and sorcery. You know, it's got the magic. It's got the mercenary protagonists trying to steal something. It's very personal, as we talked about earlier. Awesome story. It's in his, what are they? He's had several cycles. This is like his Hyperborean cycle. You mentioned Zothique earlier, Jeff. He's got these different worlds that he set his stories in.
And, my love and interest in this comes through the lens of the Appendix N. And one of the frequently asked questions is, why isn't Clark Ashton Smith in the Appendix N?
Right.
Why didn't Gary Gygax list him as an author that you should read?
Gary Gygax needs to answer for that.
Exactly. But I think your story that you bring up is a great example of why Gary Gygax might not have included him. Actually, both of our things are, because for one hand, like, there's the mummy fucking, but on the other hand, there is the fact that, like, in a lot of Clark Ashton Smith stories, the adventurers are not the heroes of their story, and it's like it's an adventure of how do we find that these people have been destroyed by the things that they find. And the story that you shared as an example, it's a great example of that, because, like, if I recall correctly, I think everybody died. I mean, spoiler alert, I think everybody dies in the end of that story, isn't that right?
He escapes, but he's maimed. He loses his hand. Okay. He is a rare character. I think he appears in I think a couple stories. He's one of the very few that actually lives another day, but he's not in one piece.
Okay. I remember when I first read Smith and how, so I didn't know what I was getting into. I was a young man, I'd loved Liber, I loved Chronicles of Amber. I hadn't been able to lay hands on Conan and any Robert E. Howard yet. Someone said, oh yeah, you know what's also some sword and sorcery is Clark Ashton Smith. So I was thinking some rollicking, swashbuckling adventure. Well, what you find is this dense, ornate prose and really nasty sorcerers. And typically, there's not a whole lot of character except for nastiness. It's really not about individuals with character arcs. It's more about some horrific thing that's going to happen and how it happens.
He is more the Lars von Trier of, like, sword and sorcery.
Yeah. I don't know Lars von Trier.
I don't know the reference either.
Lars von Trier is a filmmaker who really likes to explore the dark sexual underpinnings of the human psychic experience.
Clark Ashton Smith's fiction is very like hallucinogenic. Like it has a so, like, my favorite Clark Ashton Smith story, I think it's a literary masterpiece. It's a lot of times we don't think, like, sword and sorcery is artistically ambitious, but I think that, like, Clark Ashton Smith actually achieves some sort of philosophical insight. Is The Last Incantation. It's about this sorcerer who he's old and he knows everything and he's completely the master of the cosmos. And he thinks back to when he was a youth and his first love, and he summons the shade of his first love, and he looks at her and he dismisses her because he realizes that, like, he has changed. Like, he's kind of
he doesn't realize it at first. At first he's like, what is this thing? This isn't the person that I originally fell in love with.
Exactly. And I think that's, like, art in general. It's like you use art as, like, as an attempt to re-enchant the world, right? That's what you're doing in sword and sorcery. And, like, when Malgiris fails to, like, restore his youth using his art, literally his art, it's like I don't know. I maybe I'm reading into it too much, but I feel like Clark Ashton Smith, because I was, like, throwing up his hands at, like, art can only do so much for you the older you get. It's kind of a sad but very truthful story. So
Absolutely. I feel like Clark Ashton Smith was really good at kind of tapping in to kind of like the human experience of like, you know, what does it mean to like be a person? And with like Clark Ashton, specifically with that story, it's like, sure, we all have these like memories of like our first great love. But like, if we were to go back in our present form and look at that first great love, we would be like, really? This is the thing that we still fantasize about? Like,
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I don't think we need to really discuss Lovecraft. We've talked about two of the big three in Weird Tales. Lovecraft is horror. He never really did the sword and sorcery thing. I guess a couple of stories are tangentially related, but we should probably move on to Moore. And Catherine L. Moore, of course, everyone mentions her early on. Make sure that everyone knows that, yes, some women were writing sword and sorcery too. But I think that Brackett, in her own way, is a lot more important, even because the Jarell of Joyery stories after the first one are kind of repetitious. The thing of it is that the first one she wrote is kind of a frickin' masterpiece, Black God's Kiss.
Yep.
It has this amazing prose. I'm not to say that she wrote all kinds of wonderful things. But as far as an impact on sword and sorcery, she had one huge impact with the first, Black God's Kiss.
Yep.
Yeah,
I would agree with that. You know, I mean, that story, although I think Hellsguard, I reread that one for this panel, is excellent as well. But Black God's Kiss is a classic. It's a stone cold classic. I love the story, and it does something very different than a lot of sword and sorcery. It's really about atmosphere. It's about setting a mood. Some sword and sorcery does that, but it's a lot less focused on this propulsive action, which, you know, Howard brought to the table and a lot of these other authors did. It's, you know, she
pulls you forward anyway. You don't have to have action to pull you forward. You're gripped immediately by the tension and everything that's happening. And again, she has this beautiful prose. It kind of reminds me of William Hope Hodgson. If you ever read the novel of him, but it pulls you forward into these weird, ghastly scenes, wildly inventive and very visual.
Boats of the Glen Carrig is what the nautical, Hodgson you're talking about.
Yeah, I always preferred Hodgson's short stories to that. I wouldn't send someone off to go running off to read Boats of the Glen Carrig because I think it's better. But yeah, it's the same kind of atmosphere.
I really like Black God's Kiss too because she kills the baddie with a kiss. A lot of times, like when I try to write, my wife will tell me, "You're just writing a man with boobs," you know, like but in this case, like I think there's something very I don't know if this adjective it has valences to it that I'm not trying to, but it is a very feminine, you know, like it's a feminine means weak or something like our gut is that it means something bad. Not necessarily. I think it's a specific kind of sword and sorcery that is unique and authentic. There's
a little more of the inner character in about her conflicted feelings for this Jalome, I think his name is. My French is terrible. But yeah, it's quite a bit different. I mean, she was writing immediately in Howard's. She was a contemporary of Howard's. Black God's Kiss was 1934, so it was after Phoenix on the Sword and even after Tower of the Elephant. But it was very early, nascent days of sword and sorcery, and she was taking it in a very different direction. I think her and Smith really had a different spin on what this genre could have been. Howard was so good and so popular that he kind of propelled it in his direction.
And personally, I feel like there is absolutely no reason why men can't write female characters and why white people can't write black characters. But however, I will say that I feel like a big reason why inclusivity and diversity is important in these kinds of things is we get an insight into another person when that kind of person is writing about this character than another kind of person is. Like, for example, one of the things that I think about is Andre Norton and Witch World. And you look at that very first Witch World novel, and I'm forgetting the name of the character, but there is this one character who she is female and she has been sold off to get married to this dude. And her way of escaping this is she gets dressed up as a knight and escapes into the night and kind of becomes her own character as like a dude in armor fighting. And when I read that, I was thinking to myself, okay, here is Andre Norton, this female author who is adopting a male name to exist within a male dominated industry, which is fantasy fiction at the time. And here she is writing about this woman who is who is turning herself into a man so that she can survive. And like, there's something really potent and powerful about taking a step back and experiencing something from the perspective of somebody who actually knows what it's like to experience that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's no question. And just by the fact that she's, female in a male-dominated market, C.L. Moore, I mean, is a pioneer there. It's amazing. That's that was already occurring, and Sword and Sorcery does get a black eye in some circles, but for not being as inclusive and not having enough of the female voice, but C.L. Moore is a huge exception. Agreed, Jeff.
Now, we also have some also-rans, but I think, some people who came in and wrote some Sword and Sorcery, some of which is interesting, but I don't know that anyone else at the time period was writing anything much classic. We could mention the Elac stories and the Prince Raynor stories of Kuttner.
Yep.
I think that there is some power there and there is some interest there.
Yeah. Still being continued these days by Adrian Cole. Shout out to Adrian Cole. I'm friends with him on Facebook. Maybe he's watching this.
Yeah.
Or rather, I'm sorry. What is it when we're in space? It's not Sword and Sorcery. It's
Sword and Planet.
Sword and Planet. I feel like Lee Brackett in her Sword and Planet stuff is also a great example of it. Although it's not technically Sword and Sorcery, like when we look at our John Eric Stark stories, like those are really fantastic Sword and Sorcery stories. But it's also interesting in the way that like the industry at the time, the way that they approached and dealt
Stark
with.
was shown as a black man, even though he's described as black. Yes.
Exactly. Stark literally has black skin, not like black man black, as in blackest black. Whenever you see John Eric Stark in artwork from the time she was writing the stories, he is always a blonde dude. Somehow on the covers, he's always a blonde dude, but when you actually read the stories, he has like jet black skin from living on Mercury.
Yeah,
right.
She is one of my top favorites.
She's awesome. I think I might be burned on the stake for this. I think she outdid Edgar Rice Burroughs in terms of the Sword and Planet genre. I know she wasn't the originator of that, and I love Burroughs as much as anyone, but the Sword of Rhiannon is that's another one you have to read if you haven't read that book. Phenomenal.
Yeah, Sword of Rhiannon, it's so short. She was so good. I haven't planned on getting to her yet, but it's a natural segue. We haven't talked Liber, who preceded her, but let's go ahead and talk Brackett. We're here now. I think that even though it's Sword and Planet, unfortunately, she's a little harder to get hold of. She hasn't remained in print as well. And one of the reasons may be because her only real series character is Stark. And Stark only appears in a handful of short stories. And then very late in her life, she did a 3-part novel series, which is cool, but I honestly don't think that Stark is nearly as interesting in those as he is in those short stories.
Well, and Stark suffers because at the time she was writing Stark initially was kind of before we really understood what Mars and Venus truly were. Like back in like the Edgar Rice Burroughs era of Mars and Venus, we could imagine anything as Mars and Venus. And when Lee Brackett first started with John Era Stark, it was kind of the same thing. But then it got to a point where it's like, oh, wait, no, scientifically, we kind of understand what's going on with Mars and Venus. So now we need to call it like space or something else. Like, kind of. Yeah, Lee Brackett kind of fell into this weird gray area where like her entire world that she had been exploring was suddenly like completely nerfed.
Yeah. That's a shame because I love our Mars. It's this faded, dying planet with ancient grandeur. It was old and decrepit when Egypt was first rising from, on Earth. Lost secrets, hidden tombs, guys and gals running around with swords, but also occasionally a ray gun. It's yeah, it's great stuff. And I wish that this book, where did it go? I wish that this book were easier to get my hands on because this has
bring out the skull.
Yes. Yes.
We need some skull.
This is a great book.
Is that, Howard?
This is Lee Brackett's Sea King of Mars, and unfortunately, it's about impossible to lay hands on now.
Oh, that's the what is that series there? I've got the here. Fantasy Masterworks.
Fantasy Masterworks.
Some Fritz Leiber, same series.
Yep.
But if you can get a hold of ebooks of Lee Brackett, and I believe that Bain was still permitting access to some of those. We've already mentioned The Sword of Rhiannon. If you can't read anything else by her but these, I would start here and see if you don't fall in love with her prose as well. Enchantress of Venus, which is my very favorite of the Stark stories. Lorelei of the Red Mist, which she wrote with Ray Bradbury.
He was pretty good.
Yeah.
Ray who?
Yeah.
Isaac Wadimov?
And how about, I love these titles on these things, right? Queen of the Martian Catacombs. And
I'm in.
Yep. They're just great. And her characters were like Han Solo and the Firefly characters decades.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
You're right. Exactly.
Well, yeah. I mean, she's one of the co-writers of which of the Star Wars movies she wrote?
Empire
Strikes Back, the best one.
Yep. She's incredible.
Yeah.
I love her so much that I bothered to.
I never would have guessed. I think she might have surpassed Harold Lamb. I'm not sure.
These beautiful
Holy cow.
press books, totally worth. If you love Brackett, these things, Hafner collected about everything.
Well, we've officially entered the book porn section of the panel. People just pulling out huge volumes now.
The sexy music.
Jeff's collection's up in flames, unfortunately.
Jason, what kind of book porn do you have for us?
All of my porn-worthy books are downstairs now. I have a first edition of a hardcover of Paul Anderson's The Broken Sword.
No, you don't.
That's signed by him. So.
No, you don't.
Apparently, he does.
Oh my God! You have a first edition hardcover signed.
Yeah.
Ryan wants to know your address. So
that's one of the books well, it's debatable whether it's actually. I mean, splitting hairs. You can put it in Sword and Sorcery. You can put it in heroic fantasy. I think it's one of the top 10 fantasy novels ever written. How about that?
Yeah.
Which version is better?
Oh, that's a tough question. You probably have to go with the original. He updated it in 71, I think, for Lynn Carter's series, Valentine Adult Fantasy series. But the 54 version is unbelievable. I've actually got it on audiobook over here, but I actually don't have a print copy of the original. I've got it right here. I've got the since we're doing book porn, I've got the Ballantine reissue in 1971.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
Yeah.
Got that as well.
You got to read this book. I mean, I've probably said this 3 or 4 times.
Yeah.
Listeners, you have to read The Broken Sword. It was written in 1954, so it's pre-Tolkien.
Mm-hmm.
But I consider this possibly sword and sorcery because Poul Anderson was he was in the sword and sorcery circles. You know, he Lynn Carter put him in Saga, which was his fictitious. It was an actual group of people, but they never actually met. Sword and Sorcerers Guild of America, which I would love to get in on that.
When I interviewed Michael Moorcock, I asked him, I'm like, how did you get into the Sword and Sorcerers Guild of America? And he's like, oh, I just received a letter saying, oh, you're in it now. And I'm like, okay.
I can't believe you got that interview, by the way, Jeff. That was
incredible.
That
also, for the record, it took a year of emails to make that happen. But
oh my God, yeah, you have to go back and listen to Jeff's podcast with Michael Moorcock. But this book it's pre-Tolkienian. It is fast moving. It's definitely Icelandic saga inspired. It's got a lot of magic in it, which may push it out of sword and sorcery, including, you know, like all over the place. It's got gods that are in there. It's got the Irish gods. You've got, of course, appearances from Odin in there all over the place. You've got scenes like Ragnarok type battles. It's trolls and men and elves, but it's different elves. It's these elves are haughty. They're dangerous. They're kind of badass. They're probably like first stage Tolkien elves, you know, from his Silmarillion era.
Well, if your elves aren't hotties, you've got the wrong kind of elves.
Yeah, they're very high and mighty, but they're very like, I mean, they're almost like Melnibonéan in a way. You know, they seek pleasure. But coldly. I mean, they're very alien. They're not the cool, fun elves that sing songs and play harps all day.
You get the trope of the cursed sword. You couldn't have Doombringer without the broken sword.
That's right. Yeah, it's total Stormbringer. And in fact, Moorcock said that he I think his quote was, "It knocks the Lord of the Rings into a cocked hat." You know, he was famously not a Tolkien fan, but he loved the Broken Sword, and it absolutely influenced him clear through for all the Elric stories.
Well, let's move to Elric, and then I want to make sure that we save time to discuss Charles Saunders, who unfortunately we recently lost, as well as some more modern people. I want to touch base real quick. I want to touch real quickly on one of the greats, Fritz Leiber. A lot of people make the mistake, because it's listed as book 1, of starting their Fritz Leiber read with Swords Against Deviltry, which I argue, unfortunately, is not the place to start, because those stories were written later and they lacked some of the fire and inventiveness of early Leiber. If you're just going to try out Leiber for the first time, try Swords Against Death.
Agreed.
You only have time to read 1 or 2, then read Bazaar of the Bizarre.
I love Bazaar of the Bizarre.
Yes. Yes.
7 Black Priests, Thieves' House.
All good. Oh God, it's so good.
I would love. I feel like because his beautiful face is not visible right now, I feel like Bill has a lot to say about this, but we keep talking over Bill. Bill, I want to hear what your beautiful face has to say about Fritz Leiber and Thaford and Grey Mouser.
Well, you know. Well, what a setup, right? For nothing to say. These stories are. One thing I'll say about them is the thing about Thaford and the Grey Mouser is they're there for the same reason the reader is there. They're there to have fun, and they're sort of the most anarchic kind of. It's almost hard to say. They themselves are sort of ironically detached from what they're doing a lot of times, in the same way that I think Leiber's prose is. There's always an archness and kind of he's having fun. He's inviting you along to have fun with them. They're going to get the last laugh, always. But it's and this is not to confuse it with parody or satire or him not taking it seriously. He takes it all. Well, relatively seriously, I should say. Maybe not very seriously. He's not he's not like Howard. I think Howard is there and his fingers are bleeding on his typewriter, you know, and Leiber's maybe just kind of kicking back and laughing along with his characters.
Yep.
But they're just a perfect kind of duo. I think Howard came up with sort of the perfect lone adventuring figure, and Leiber came along and came up with two guys that were just perfect foils for each other. Mm-hmm. They're capable of being heroic. They're capable of having, let's just say, greater sort of human capacities in life. But at base, they're essentially they're essentially stomachs and loins that are getting on with an adventure, and they've got pretty clear goals. They run into trouble everywhere they go. Yeah, they're just a lot of fun. Those stories are fantastic. And like Bizarre the Bizarre, it's almost a vignette. That's how short it is and how sort of simple it is in just if you looked at the plot. It's really the mouser goes shopping, gets in trouble. Right? And Fafford has to bail him out. But there's so much more going on than that. And you know, the whole idea, there's an international consortium of people that are hell-bent on selling garbage.
International? I think you mean
interdimensional. Sorry, I was confusing it with the real world there for a second. But there's, you know, these guys are basically amassing every resource in these universes they encounter and exchanging them for garbage. And it's just ridiculous, but it's also not so ridiculous that you don't take it seriously or that you think it's silly. It's never silly. There's silliness in it, but it's never silly.
A great sword and sorcery tale while also being this really interesting like discussion on capitalism. Like, I feel like one of the things that I think is interesting is how
the Great Depression.
Absolutely. And there are people who I think really like to argue that like going back to sword and sorcery is going back to pre-message fiction. And it's like, I don't think that's true at all.
No.
Like a lot of these authors were absolutely exploring contemporary issues through these stories. And I feel like Bizarre of the Bizarre is a great example of like just exploring the absurdity of capitalism in the guise of heroic fiction.
He drops an elbow off the top turnbuckle in capitalism in that story. I have to mention two Leiber stories, and so I love his old stuff. Completely in agreement. I think maybe I could disagree a little bit. I think he may have peaked in mid-career. I have two stories I want to mention. Stardock, which I absolutely love. That was 1965, fantastic. It was published. I read it though first in Swords Against Wizardry. Jeff Jones cover, by the way. I mean, that's awesome artwork. But basically, the antagonist in Stardock is a mountain. I mean, they're climbing a mountain, and that mountain, the way he portrays this mountain. If you're a writer out there or a want-to-be writer, you have to read Stardock. You will almost wet your pants. The edge of the seat danger in that story, and just the way, I think Fritz Leiber was a climber or did some climbing in his lifetime. Phenomenal. Just what he did. Some amazing exchanges between the characters too. Will make you laugh out loud. You mentioned that earlier, Bill. It's just like, it's tongue in cheek, a lot of this stuff. It's so good. And then of course I have to mention Ilmet and Lankmar, which won the Hugo and the Nebula. That was 1970. So he would have been 60. But God, that is so light and fun, but then it gets real dark at the end, right? You have the I don't know if I want to spoil it. I'll just leave it at that. It gets real dark at the end.
Yeah, and I think Ilmet is a better introduction to the characters than the two novellas that started the first collection.
100%. What is the one where Fafford and Master both start working for different gods?
Oh yeah, with Ithaca the Jug.
Oh yeah.
God.
That's probably my favorite, but I can't think of the name of it.
That's great. Lean Times. Yeah.
Nice one.
Yes.
Yeah. Awesome.
I really like how in Ilmet they're drinking so much. It's such a easy story. Like it kind of like as you read it, the aesthetic effect is like when you're on a bender, you know, like it gets hazy, right? All of the phantasmagoria of like the mists going in and to get more wine from the jugs of wine at the tavern. Like it's very atmospheric. I recommend that as the first one, but I also think that there are the Adam's Gambit is really good too.
Well, in a way, Ill-Met is the origin story. It's the origin of how they met. I mean,
and wasn't it
Ill-Met, but it's not the first. Obviously, he rewrote that mid-career, but it is the first time they may have met one other time in one other story without knowing it. I'm going back in hazy memory banks here, but yeah, that sort of is a great origin story for them. I agree, Bill. That probably should have been the lead in the first.
I got to say, I like that story, but I don't know that it's the best introduction. I've talked to too many people who bounced off of Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser. I think that one has more power if you've already read the best ones that came before. And I think that the awards that he got for that might not have even been quite as much for the excellence of that story, but it's like, you've been writing this excellent stuff. We haven't recognized you enough. Here's an award.
The Susan Luchey Award. Yes.
Well, and also, looking at this through the lens of the Appendix N, there is nothing more Dungeons and Dragons than Fafhrd and Grey Mouser.
Oh yeah.
In my mind.
Well, how about this? In Ill-Met and Lankmeyer, I wrote this down as a note. There's a thieves guild in it, and actually you're introduced to Slevius, who's a master thief candidate, master thief, and Fisif, thief second class. I mean, you might as well write second level thief. It's all right there. I mean, the whole thieves guild and even almost character classes are spelled out in that story. That is lifted by Gygax and et al. And published in the Player's Handbook.
Already running low on time. I thought 2 hours. I should have known better. I want to make sure that we talk about Charles Saunders, who it turns out we lost early in March. And we didn't know because apparently no one knew. And it's just terrible. There is an unsung giant. And he's never been appreciated as much as he deserved. Amaro was one of my very favorite sword and sorcery characters. Bill, you recently wrote about him. What do you want to say about Amaro and Saunders' work in particular?
Yeah, it's as you say, he really is overlooked, unsung. There's this whole mess with his publication history, and it breaks your heart to see it, really, because the stuff is as good as any of the best stuff that's in this genre. I remember when I first read Amaro and the sequel, they'd come out from Nightshade, and I was reviewing them, and I was floored because I think they'd announced that there wouldn't be any more. Like, this was his second time around being published, and then
they had to cancel the line because it wasn't selling,
Right. Yeah, and I remember I reached out to you, Howard. I actually was like, "Is this true? Like, this is terrible." But they're just so good. I mean,
yeah.
Maybe the simplest way to describe it is what was the tagline? It's the epic story of. Did they call him a Black Conan or a Black Tarzan? I think
Black
they used
Tarzan.
Both. Black Tarzan.
And actually, that resulted in his book being withdrawn by the Edgar Rice Burroughs estate.
Oh, that's right. And then
they
he got
disputed
sued.
it. Yeah. And they changed it to the epic novel of a jungle hero.
Right.
But it was a black, yeah.
It's so ridiculous. Just for a stupid tagline that didn't even need to be there, really. Basically, these are fantastic sword and sorcery tales. They read a lot. Like, you can see that there's a Robert E. Howard DNA underneath this sort of thing. You can tell he's inspired by Howard and a lot of the other classics we're talking about. Transported to a fictional Africa. This is a fictional East Africa. He also has a hero who's a fictional West African heroine, actually.
Nyambani.
Yes.
Yep. If I'm pronouncing that correct.
Yeah, and I think that means home in Swahili, or there's a cognate of that or something. But yeah, they're really brilliant stories. He's an excellent prose writer. The stories moved as fast as any kind of pulp stories, but they don't have that sort of excess. He's a much smoother kind of writer than the actual kind of pulp guys that came out of that tradition.
Mm-hmm.
Really never got a fair shake, I don't feel. And then, his late career renaissance, I'm so glad we had that, and we have what we have. And, he was still firing on all cylinders there with his later stuff. Yeah, I just wish we had another 20, 30 years of him being rewarded for the stuff that he did so well. It would have been nice for all of us. But unfortunately, that's not what happened. But we did get what we got, and the stories are great. I mean,
and more people need to read. There's another important point. Jason, you were talking earlier about characters who are actually heroic in addition to being sword and sorcery characters. Amaro is one of the few that I would kind of like to hang out with. He's such a cool guy. He's such a nice guy.
Yeah, that's where you get the more heroic fiction. That's when you can really understand the label as opposed to like a sword and sorcery, straight sword and sorcery.
The thing I like about MRO, there are many things I like about it, and I agree. Saunders is a great writer, and it's a shame that there was a Kickstarter to raise money for his tombstone because he was going to be buried in an unmarked grave, apparently.
Imagine that, yeah. Milton Davis was involved in that.
Milton Davis was involved, and he got that started. But MRO was, I don't know, MRO. I never say these things out loud until I'm on a panel once every 6 years, and then I have to say them, and I don't know how to pronounce any of it. I've read it 1,000 times, but it's it's rare you're introduced to a sword and sorcery character when they're a child. He's brought into this tribe. What are they called? The Ileasi tribe. His mother gave birth to him, but his father is they don't know who he is, and that's a big no-no. The Ileasi are kind of conservative tribe, and they bring him in, and he gets bullied incessantly, picked on. I reread Turkana Knives, which is one of the first stories that kicks off the original Imaro collection. There's a guy, Kanoko, who's a real bastard, and sends basically torments Imaro's bull, which then runs off. He chases it into the grasslands where there's just this palpable danger. You have lions, hyenas that are monstrous and even more fearsome than they are in our modern in the 20th century America. But what I love about it is it really, more so than a lot of sword and sorcery, there's a lot of character focus, and the journey of the character is as much internal as external. It's about where he came from, making sense of this horrible tragedies he had done to him as a small boy, and how he grows into a man. A lot more personal, I think, than perhaps a lot of sword and sorcery is. Mm-hmm. And it gives you the full arc over the story. I'll be honest, I haven't read all the Charles Saunders. I have that on my to-be-read pile, but I've read his early stuff, and it's phenomenal. And I'm really looking forward to reading some of the later material he put out.
Yeah, it's interesting that even though they started as short stories, and we're all very familiar with how short stories being fixed up into a novel, the character and the quest that he's on and everything, it does translate into a novel series very well, right there with the origin stories. I don't know the provenance of every story and what order he originally wrote them, but the end effect of everything together is pretty seamless. As opposed to, say, Liber, who we were just talking about, where tonally, just his prose style, everything is varied, highly varied, because he's writing it throughout his career.
I almost never reread the later Lonkmar stories.
Yeah, I'm not as crazy about those.
Yeah. I've just communed with the Cyclops running Cyclops Con, and if you guys want to keep going for another 20, 30 minutes, we can.
I can go a little longer, sure. Okay. I'm surprised I haven't had to have a bathroom break yet. Or maybe I have.
Yeah. I might just be sitting in a puddle of my own filth right now.
And it's on fire.
It's on fire. Yes. Highly flammable.
Well, why don't we double back to Moorcock and Elric and
Yeah, it's good.
I'm going to recommend Michael Moorcock to modern readers. What do you think people ought to read? What really stands out?
For me, I personally love the original stories that Moorcock wrote himself from the very beginning. So when Moorcock first started writing the Elric stories, those were originally collected in 2 paperback collections, one called Stealer of Souls and one called Stormbringer. And once he later went back and started writing more of these stories, he was writing them from the from earlier and was writing a bunch of prequel stories. But I love the stories that Moorcock first was writing as an angry young man who was very interested in like writing about this character who was just like full of like self-pity and self-hatred, but like
emo.
Yeah. Because the thing is, we also haven't really mentioned Jack Vance, which although Jack Vance might not really be sword and sorcery, I will say that like Eyes of the Overworld is the only story that I've read as a part of my Appendix N project that made me laugh out loud. And I will also say that Stormbringer is the only story that actually made me shed a literal tear. Like I actually cried when I read the last story in the Michael Moorcock series, the very final story of Elric, which was written far before he wrote a bunch of the other stories, is so incredibly moving and so powerful. I love it.
Wow.
It's about like there's a degraded society, and this I think Elric is trying to like transcend that society. It's like a really compelling I'm sorry, I spoke before I had a fully formed thought. I'm sorry. I agree. I feel very moved in a distinctive way when I read the Elric stories, and I think it has something to do with it has to do with living in modernity and like in our situation and trying to maintain your humanity, but the society itself is corrupt,
Yeah, it's just ugly.
If Tiffany Trump were a folk hero. Sorry.
You just went there.
Apologies.
Well, yeah, I mean, he's a fish out of water, right? He's a Melnibonean, if I pronounce that correct. But he is very uncomfortable on the throne. I mean, that's actually a trope of sword and sorcery, right? You've got, if you go dialing it back to Conan again, when he's Phoenix on the sword, he's the king of Aquilonia, but he is an outsider through and through, doesn't like where he is being plotted against. And that feels like the same with Elric. He's it is a culture that's just pure degradation. They torture people for fun. They mutilate their enemies. They castrate and they alter the vocal cords of young kids so they can sing one perfect note, and they put them all up on stage to sing in a choir. I mean, just god awful stuff. And Elric feels very uncomfortable in this society, and it does make you emote with the character, because you feel, like you said, Jeff, you especially when you're young, or I mean, almost at any age, if you don't like the culture you're in, you don't like the way society you live in, you can feel that in the character, and that comes through clearly with Moorcock in that period of his life.
Really kind of taps into this very kind of primal experience as what it means to be like an angry young man. It's like growing up, my favorite filmmaker was John Waters. And one of the things about John Waters is when people ask him, like, how did you start making movies like Hairspray and things like this, like rated PG movies, after you're making these completely outrageous, shocking films? And John Waters' response was like, you can only be an angry young man for so long. And I feel like that's kind of what Michael Moorcock really encapsulates in those early Elric stories. Is it's this angst and this anger and this like feeling of not belonging and questioning your place in society that you can really only fully experience or understand when you are a young person, like really kind of exorcising this kind of angst.
Mm-hmm. Great way to put it, yeah.
There's this, I'm kind of going off topic, but there's this, he wrote Lipstick Traces, History of Punk Rock.
I didn't know that.
I forget his name. Oh, no, Michael Moorcock didn't write that.
Ah, okay. He's written a lot.
But you know, I sometimes, if I squint, I see that late 60s gothic goth punk person in England, you know, anti-Cold War, you know, in Elric. Elric is the sword and sorcery version of that, you know, so.
Right. And he was, yeah, arguably the first character written in opposition to Conan. You know, I mean, he was weak unless he was on drugs. Very, you know, cerebral. Not that Conan isn't, but more reflective in nature.
But raised to be cerebral, which is very
right
in Conan's upbringing.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Well, and he starts as an emperor and then leaves, whereas Conan famously, well, ends up being a king. So
yeah,
the opposite there. He doesn't want a throne, Elric.
Exactly.
The idea of, like, you know, kill your idols. Like, Michael Moorcock is like this fantastic example of, like, he is somebody who clearly was very influenced by sword and sorcery and very influenced by Conan. So he wrote something that was just going to murder Conan and Conan's legacy, but in a way that doesn't undermine Conan and the Conan legacy, but instead furthers it.
Mm-hmm.
I also like those short stories. I prefer them. Is there an easy way to get a hold of them, or have they been kind of overwritten because they've been, you know, the Conan cycle kind of the Elric cycle kind of gobbled them up? Is anyone aware of an easy way to get a hold of them without searching through old paperbacks?
There's Del Rey is putting them out. I've bought a few of these. I think there's even a more recent release of the Elric stories, but you can get them pretty readily.
Yeah. And that's the thing, is it can be very confusing when you're reading about Elric and where to start. But exactly the paperback that Brian is holding in his hands right now by Del Rey is a fantastic starting point.
Healer of Souls. Badass.
Yes.
I actually want to mention, because Howard, you mentioned stuff a little off the beaten path. I suspected we were going to talk about Elric, so I wanted to talk about, just briefly, about Corum.
Oh, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, the Knight of the Swords. This is the first book of Corum. It's a nice, tidy, 176-page paperback. It was written in 1971, so it was written after the first Elric stories. Now, Moorcock would return to the character of Elric, revisit him later, but this one is so. Moorcock had an amazing imagination, and he had some amazing inventions. I think that's one of his strengths as a writer. I mean, he arguably on a sentence level, I mean, he's a very good writer. Arguably, he doesn't have the poetry of Howard or the effortless style of Leiber, but his concepts that he put in there, the multiverse, the conflicts of law and order, the eternal champion. So Corum is one of the eternal champions, as is Elric. What I like about Corum is that Corum is a little less emo, frankly, than Elric. He's a lot more comfortable where he is. He's in a decadent society, but decadent not in a bad way. Like, they didn't go down a dark path like the Melnimaneans. They were sort of art for art's sake. I forget what the name of them were. They were the Vadog and the Nodrog. These two different races. And then you had the Mabden, which is the humans, came in, and these are the young upstarts. But they basically torch these old races. They decimate and murder Corum's family. And what really is shocking about it is he gets maimed right out of the gate. Like, they rip out his eye, they cut off a hand, and he has to seek out a sorcerer who, and this is another D&D-ism that I believe was borrowed from the Coram stories. He has to seek out the, what is it called here? It's the hand and the eye. We know of the hand and eye of Vecna from Dungeons and Dragons. They're artifacts. It's the eye of Rin and the hand of Quill, Kwll. It's the same thing, but they're basically artifacts that become part of his body.
I ought to know that because I've read those about 4 times over the course of my life. I really loved those when I was a kid, more than I loved Elric. But then I didn't have access to just the Elric short stories.
Yeah.
I really dug the Coram stuff, and I think people ought to take a look at those. And then, of course, there's also Hawkmoon. There's a wide variety.
He wrote a lot of stuff.
Yeah. Well, we've given him about 10 minutes. Let's move to another greats. Vance has been mentioned.
Would it be all right if I mentioned somebody else real quick?
Absolutely.
So one of the questions we had earlier were the kind of the underdogs of sword and sorcery. And one of the underdogs of sword and sorcery that I am so grateful that Gary Gygax decided to highlight in the Appendix N is Margaret St. Clair. Margaret St. Clair, her work is absolutely it is incredibly difficult to find these days because the rights around who owns Margaret St. Clair's work is so complicated. But there is a story called The Shadow People that I am absolutely obsessed with. And if you want to find a used copy of The Shadow People, you're looking at spending at least probably $25 on eBay or Amazon to get a used copy of this paperback. And there is no ebook available in any kind of official capacity. But like Margaret St. Clair's The Shadow People is this really amazing like sword and sorcery story that takes place in hippie era Berkeley, 1969, and involves like psychedelic mushrooms and people exploring like weird catacombs in the basements in Berkeley that lead them to these like subterranean elven lairs. And I gotta say, like Margaret St. Clair's The Shadow People, phenomenal. Highly recommend.
All right, that's one I have to write down, Jeff, because I've heard of Margaret St. Clair. I've seen her name in the Appendix N, but I haven't read anything by her.
The Shadow People.
The Shadow People. All right, here's my pen. I'm writing that down.
Please do. You might, and if I don't know how many people are watching this, it might be one person, might be 40 people, might be 100 people. I don't know, but like you might be up against them in terms of eBay bids, but just. Very least show a little patience and set up an eBay notification for when it becomes available, because I promise you will be happy with Margaret St. Clair's The Shadow People.
We should put out a list, Howard, after this panel of the things we were recommending.
It kind of reminds me of I haven't read her, but it reminds me of Zelazny's Amber Chronicles, which they're on the Appendix N too, right? It's interesting that these kind of gateway fantasies are on the Appendix N.
Yeah.
And I always thought that Chronicles of Amber was adjacent enough that I used to call it Sword and Sorcery. Maybe it still is. I know that and Swords Against Death by Leiber were my introductions and what converted me from being fascinated with science fiction and Star Trek almost solely when I was in junior high to being wide open to fantasy and particularly sword and sorcery. So yeah. Silvish the Damned by Zelazny is probably a better example of pure sword and sorcery, but I love Amber. It's one of my touchstones.
I don't know if this is an underdog. He's probably kind of a hated name in many corners of sword and sorcery. But I like Elsprag de Camp's The Tritonian Ring.
I like that.
It's just a heck of a lot of fun. It was written actually in the early 50s, but this particular version that I have is, I think, from 77, First Ballantine Books edition. What's cool about it is it's very Mediterranean and Greek, and it draws on the sort of the old Greek pantheon of gods. But you know, the hero is this Vakar of Lorsk. He's very much in the vein of I'm drawing a blank now. Character from Vance that you like,
Kugel?
Jeff. Kugel, yes. Kugel. Or very, like the Jurgen anti-hero. He's kind of like that, kind of a bumbling hero, I guess you'd call him. But we mentioned earlier that Moorcock perhaps being the first to write in opposition to Conan. Actually, L. Sprague de Camp apparently picked up one of the Conan novels, one of the Gnome hardcovers in the early maybe it was 1950, and was turned off by it because Howard put a stirrup in there where it didn't belong. And so he wanted to write a historically accurate version of the Hyborian Age. So he created these Pusad tales where the Tritonian ring is set. And yes, that does piss me off as well, because that's like throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Like there's one bad song on Led Zeppelin 4, so the whole album sucks. Like,
well, Sprague's too literal minded. Too literal minded. Very
literal minded. But I actually really like this story. It is fun. It's got humor in it. At one point he pulls up to a dock and he's looking around for help, and he says, "Hey, you there with the nose, come over." It's got a lot of one-liners. It's funny.
I'll recommend another Sprague real quick, and it's called Lest Darkness Fall, and it's a modern man goes back to 6th century Italy, and he ends up. You got to understand, like, the Roman Empire at the time is highly fragmented. Italy is being dominated by Vandals in North Africa and Lombards in the north, and the Byzantine Emperor Justinian is trying to reconquer Italy at the time. So this guy finds himself in the midst of all this, and he ends up, not in small part to his creation of whiskey stills and his industrialized production of alcohol, hard alcohol in Rome at the time. He basically ends up subverting history, and Rome becomes a sort of independent state. That's more of the end of it, but it's a real fun sort of time travel, almost the Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's court, but he's actually successful and not that ridiculous, and he sort of shows them all how it's done. It's a pretty good story. I recommend it.
My little brother, who is an engineer, does not like fantasy. He loves that novel. So.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun.
It's a neat one. Would like that, yeah. Real quick, somebody in the chat said that the UK Amazon store has a Kindle edition of the Shadow People. So if you're interested in reading what I was talking about, go to amazon.co.uk and get your Kindle edition there.
I've already been on eBay. I put in 6 bids.
Okay, perfect. Well, I'm just glad that I've already purchased all of the remaining books as a part of the Appendix N book club, because Hoy and I, for a while, we discovered there were a few books where we were actually bidding against each other.
Were you really? Do you know his handle on eBay?
At this point, we have everything coming up. So
let's share some more overlooked ones. How about Keith Taylor's Bard?
Oh, wow.
Now, this is a series that really ought to be reprinted.
Yeah, Keith Taylor's great.
Yeah, it's historical, so it's not secondary world, but there's sorcery, all sorts of Celtic mythology stuff, an actual bard. This one here happens to be pretty groovy, and it also has the probably best giant spider fight I've seen that Robert E. Howard didn't write. It's pretty awesome.
Nice.
Yeah, here's a good one.
Taylor also co-wrote at least 2 of the Cormac McArt pastiches with Andrew Offutt, and those are really awesome. And then I also wanted to make, and he's still active today writing great stuff, by the way.
Yes, he is.
I also wanted to make sure, here's another active writer today, Mask of the Sorcerer.
Great book.
No, it's sort of a
Daryl Schweitzer.
Pseudo-ancient Egypt, and this is definitely more on the Clark Ashton Smith side, except without any mummy love. But it's all about sorcerers and magical powers and strange things going down there, and it can get a little metaphysical sometimes. It's really grand stuff. It's really a classic, actually. I wish more people were reading it. Mask of the Sorcerer.
I agree with you, Howard. Just a real quick point about Mask of the Sorcerer is it's like you say, it's more of a Clark Ashton Smith, and it's more in that vein. But it's to me, I think it's the most compelling. Normally, I think a sorcerer, magic, all that, that's your antagonist. Not just for maybe obvious reasons, but okay, here we actually get the perspective of the sorcerer, somebody who starts as a child and develops these abilities. And it's compelling, and I think above all, it sort of maintains that mythical kind of quality to the magic, which it really feels like it has this sort of the depth and richness of like an actual like myth or actual religion, or those actual understandings of what magic would be, as opposed to, I just got a new level, I can now learn a new spell kind of approach to magic, and that's definitely not this. I also highly recommend The Mask of the Sorcerer. It's very impressive.
And you said that was Daryl Schweitzer. I'll have to write that one down.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Okay, I get at least 2 out of this.
Can I talk about I don't know if an underdog is the right word, but David C. Smith's Oron. This is it's a very, like, I would describe it as an artful sword and sorcery. He wrote it when he was really young, and it's very sincere, and it's dark. It's like you can put Tritonian Ring on one side and Oron on the other, right? If Tritonian Ring was like just for fun, let's it's a pre-modern adventure, some magic and some jokes. I think Oron is philosophical. There's depth there. It's really intriguing.
David does the dark very well. He's still writing today.
Mm-hmm.
And he's another one active today, still doing good work.
Yep.
Another modern author of sword and
Jeff,
sorcery.
I think you're muted.
I was muted.
Oh, were you saying something, Jeff?
That's all right, but go ahead, Bill, and I'll go ahead and share mine after yours.
Okay, I was just going to mention Stephen Brust, who's been writing a series for about 35 years now, the Jareg series, Vlad Tauthos series. They're really excellent short novels. They have a sort of a hard-boiled sensibility. I would definitely call them sword and sorcery, even though you could argue about the particulars. But he's still going strong. They're really fun, kind of interesting novels, and they're all in the vein of this. And again, they're all short novels. So
my underdog recommendation, in addition to Margaret St. Clair's The Shadow People, if you're looking for actually good, go to Margaret St. Clair's Shadow People. If you're looking for wild and crazy, I also recommend Gardner F. Fox's Kothar Barbarian Swordsman.
Oh, yeah, we didn't get into that stuff.
We did not. And I really recommend Kothar Barbarian Swordsman. If you're like me and you're a big fan of horror films, and you really like Rob Zombie, for example, because you know that Rob Zombie, when you're watching a Rob Zombie film, you can tell he knows his horror movie references, and he has a genuine love of the genre. When you're reading a Gardner F. Fox Kothar story, you can tell he's not taking it too seriously, and he knows his references, and he loves the genre. And when you read the very first Kothar book, which is called Kothar Barbarian Swordsman, there is an introduction to Kothar Barbarian Swordsman that is incredible. And it is written by a college professor who is talking about this philosopher who has been sharing about all of these various things that show you how Kothar's message to the world is really a universal message. It
is hilarious.
Gardner F. Fox is writing the whole thing. He's pretending to be this professor. He's making up this making up this philosopher who's talking about Kothar. All of this is completely made up by Gardner F. Fox as a way where he's both making fun of the really like overly serious introductions that Lynn Carter and L. Sprague de Camp give the Conan stories, but also paying homage to them in this beautiful way. So I highly recommend reading Kothar Barbarian Swordsman because they're just so much fun. They're so much fun.
They are. I think he's the best of the pastiche writers that came in Howard's wake. You had Lynn Carter with Thongor, you had John Jakes with the Brack stories. But I agree, like Gardner Fox, great stuff. He also did Kyrick. Yeah, it was Kyrick. I recommend all of them. They're fun reads. They absolutely are fun reads. Like, yeah, they're not anyone's definition of fine literature, but man, they're just fun. And each one's like a mini D&D scenario. There's a lot.
I had a hard time.
You had a hard time.
Yeah. I mean, it's okay. It's kind of like watching the Sword and Sorcery cartoon.
Yeah.
That's a good way of describing it.
It is.
Well, cut down on. I love Gardner Fox, some of his work. For instance, this, I'd much rather reread this than tackle another Coca. I'd go back to the first 2 or 3. This is just a great swashbuckling adventure story, heroic fantasy. But it's historical fiction, but this is excellent. Really great stuff.
Yeah, another just Deuce Richardson over at DMR recommended his historicals. He said they're really good. I haven't read his historicals. I've only read.
I have not either.
Yeah.
That one's good. The Borgia Blade.
Okay.
I don't recommend One Sword for Love.
He also did all kinds of comic books, like classic Silver Age comic books, and
correct. He's one of the co-creators of the Flash.
Yep.
And of, I believe, the JLA.
So the guy knew what he was doing, I think, but he was taking the piss out of Sword and Sorcery a little bit, I think.
He also wrote some erotic novels under the name of Rod Gray. And instead of the man from Uncle, he wrote stories about the lady from Lust, L-U-S-T.
Wow.
The Poisoned Pussy and
Oh, yeah, I got that one.
Come on, this is PG-13, Jeff.
And the Copulation Explosion. These were available on very visible racks in your bookstore. So
I know. I love that whole men's adventure and men's erotic fiction era of our past, the 60s and 70s. There was some crazy shit going on back then.
Oh yeah, back in the day, the fold-out cigarette ad in the center of your paperback.
Yeah.
We haven't mentioned Carl Edward Wagner.
Yes.
Okay, yeah. We better tackle that, and then we better go out.
Okay.
Let's do Wagner.
Bloodstone's amazing.
I love Bloodstone. It is just over the top nuts, and it's great. I mean, I kind of described it as the Rosetta Stone of Sword and Sorcery because it's like, that's probably giving it too much credit. But you know, it's really about, and we talked a lot earlier in the panel about modernity and the revolt against, you know, the Maxim machine guns and the gas of World War I and the dehumanization of that. And this is like, you know, Kane, who's an immortal redhead, 300-pound jacked sorcerer, really cool character. He encounters this ancient alien race that's got this amazing technology, and he attempts to turn it around and use it to conquer the world. I mean, Kane is like Carl Edward Wagner rejected the term anti-hero, but he was through and through, from one story to the next. He could be just an absolute bastard, or he could be portrayed as sympathetic in other stories. I agree. Bloodstone is a must read.
Start? I mean, what about some of the short stories? Are there one or two that
I want to recommend? Cold Light. Cold Light is about a guy who's hunting Kane. He's this guy who's ostensibly a good character, but he is he's, I guess you'd call him possessed. He's sort of like a fundamentalist, almost like a wild fundamentalist Christian who's literally interpreting the Bible and pulling all kinds of evil out of it. So he goes after Kane and tries to hunt him down and kill him. And he bands together about 6 or 7 dudes. They all have names. It sort of reminds me of Predator. It's like the Predator version for Sword and Sorcery. You've got this gang of heroes trying to kill Kane, who's holed up in this haunted town of, I think it's called Del Monte or Del Morte, I think it's called. And they're all going after him. He's picking them off one by one with these traps or just his prowess. He's hunting them down one after the next, these amazing mercenaries that they have met their match in Kane. It's wildly good, so good. Would recommend checking that one out. I think you can get it in. He's got a collection called Death Angel's Shadow. It's got a few of his short stories in there. It's got Reflections for the Winter of My Soul, which is a great werewolf story, Cold Light, and another story called Mirage.
I believe now that all of the Wagner stories are available as ebooks, although you might want to check through the collection and see what's in the TSC, because I'm not sure the titles are necessarily the same as those old.
Yeah, he's begging for reprints, and these are the Warner paperbacks that are getting very hard to find and expensive. Centipede Press released these, and now they're like $200, $300 to get in on those things. But you can still find the Warners kicking around sometimes. But they are an ebook now, Howard, I believe. Yeah.
Well, here we are. We're closing up. I think Cyclops will be angry if we go on too much longer. Does anyone want to close with anyone have final words that they want to pass along?
Sword and sorcery is a great genre. If you haven't been able to piece that together from the past 2.5 hours, we love it. There's a lot of good reading to be had. It's foundational. It's very different than a lot of what people consider fantasy, which is the fat fantasy, which is, I love Tolkien. And I'm going to say, I personally, Tolkien is my favorite author of all time in the fantasy genre, but sword and sorcery is my favorite genre of fantasy. It's great. Lot to be had there.
Yeah, I just want to thank you for having me on the panel. So
yeah, this was great. Thank you.
Bill, did you want to say something?
No, I think Brian summed it up very nicely. Just one just going back earlier to a point that Jeff made when he was saying how we were starting to learn about Mars and Venus when Lee Brackett was kind of doing her thing as opposed to Burroughs was doing his thing, and it just reminded me that in a way, going back to a time period when there were, say, Robert E. Howard was kind of interested in maybe some less than scientific notions of continental drift or lost races of people devolving into something else and then becoming again something else. Like all these sort of things that nowadays, I think, nowadays you couldn't write Barsoom, right? And I just think that there's something wonderful about a time when some of the limitations to human knowledge allowed for sort of the imagination to expand and kind of fill the gaps, right? Robert E. Howard, it's secondary world fiction, but it's actually a pre-cataclysmic age. It's set here on this planet. So I don't know. I just think that that's part of the quality of reading older fiction or really reading anything from a different time period is you're going to get exposed to things that really no one in your own time period could really come up with or take seriously enough to develop. So it's just kind of a
great point,
an interesting texture for fiction of this period.
Absolutely. And thank you for saying that, Bill. I also feel like in general, in addition to, we are confined by our new scientific discoveries.
Exactly. Yeah.
But we are also confined by the rules that we set for ourselves. So it's like we have decided as a society in 2020 what elves are and what dragons are.
Oh, that's absolutely true. It's become commercialized now. So now there's a brand associated. I mean, half of the discussion of what is a definition of sword and sorcery? You have to tiptoe around. This is branding now, right? So, yeah, and exactly. And I think a lot of modern fiction that is interested in fantasy. I think a lot of the people are getting sort of second, third, fourth, fifth, 18th hand kind of stuff, and they don't necessarily go back to the wellspring, and they don't necessarily sort of. So, from that perspective alone, I'd say I would recommend. You don't have to go all the way back to Homer, although you should. But if you want to go back to the pulp fiction of the 30s, I think it's a great place to kind of get in touch with this reservoir of human experience that we've all been a part of.
Yeah, Bill, I agree with you completely. There's something very exciting and freeing about going back to this fiction before we have somehow, like as a culture, decided upon what all of these various definitions are. There's something so freeing about that. And it's a great way of reminding ourselves that like we're actually not bound by these chains of genre that we have like agreed that we are going to go like submit to. So there's something very exciting about that.
Yes, for sure. But just don't violate the submission guidelines now when you're submitting a story. you can't actually leap beyond those bounds. You have to do what they say. But
Joseph Goodman says there are no ziggurats or no
right, exactly.
So as long as you're avoiding ziggurats and tentacles, you're totally fine. But other than that,
that's actually good life advice.
Yes.
It's interesting that you guys finished on that note, because that's one of the principles of Magician's Skull is we want to go back to the well. Same kind of creative well, but come up with different ideas. But before all this was codified, before we all had to worry about alignments and orcs behave this way and that way and whatever else. Kuttner's dwarf was very different from Poul Anderson's dwarf, which was different from Poul Anderson's and so on and so on.
Moorcock had a dwarf that was a giant.
Yeah, they invent whole worlds in paragraphs, the way Dunsany or Vance might do. You know, an entire society just tossed off, and then they move on to describe the next one. We need a little bit more of that wild creativity and vivid imagination and color.
Agreed.
No, dwarves have to have Scottish accents.
Of course, that goes without saying. You will face outright rejection if you don't have a Scottish accent in your dwarfs.
Unless they're singing songs about doing the dishes, they are not dwarves.
I think we could clearly have gone on for much longer. There's many books I never even got around to discussing.
And whole authors.
And authors.
Yeah,
it was a real pleasure, and I really thank you all for your time and your extended time. And I'd also like to tip a hat to Thorin, working behind the scenes to make all this possible. And I'd also like to bow down to the mighty Cyclops for hosting this entire convention.
Absolutely. Thank you, Cyclops, and thank you, Skull, and any other monsters or sorcerous entities that we need to appease with our thanks.
You're going to be next to last for immolation now, since you brought the Skull's name up. That's well done.
I know how the game is played, Howard.
All right, everyone. Thanks again.
Take care now.
Thank you. It's good talking to all of you.